This is the most bipartisan cooperation we've seen.
I'm not going to sit on his lap, but we will. Thank you to the ranking member, and we always figure out how to make it work. We'll start again, not quite from the top, but I recognize myself for an opening statement. As I mentioned, in my office, I often hear a lot of people come through and say we need to do permitting reform, that permitting is holding up progress, that the results of permitting are that we're not only hurting economic development, and oftentimes we're missing opportunities to actually protect and enhance the environment. And as I said, it's a bipartisan issue. It's not just people who vote Republican that are coming in my office to tell me that. We had a hearing on this topic in July, and in that hearing, many of my friends across the aisle were calling fouls on the current administration, saying they shouldn't be doing this. But you know what? This time a year ago, on our side of the aisle, we were calling fouls on the Biden administration, saying they shouldn't be doing this. So I think this is an opportunity for Congress to exert their Article I authority and to create a system that doesn't change when an administration changes, but a system that's fair, a system that allows access for all projects, and a system that's blind to the project that is being proposed. As we've heard from a lot of witnesses, reforming NEPA will provide certainty for all projects and for all sectors of the economy. In fact, the minority's witness at our July hearing stated, and I quote, "Any NEPA reform shouldn't pick winners or losers," end quote. Fairness requires that the permitting process proceed in a way that is blind to a project. By ensuring this, we will allow the free market to make decisions. I asked two engineers who testified in July if the NEPA process can be streamlined without sacrificing environmental quality. They both said unequivocally that we can, and I fully agree. Amending the underlying statutes to provide predictability to the regulated community and our federal agencies will strengthen the economy, improve the environment, and save agency resources. We have three bipartisan bills before us today that would address these issues in different ways. First off, we have H.R. 573, introduced by Representative Yakym from Indiana, which would create common sense reporting requirements for the Council of Environmental Quality, or CEQ. As part of a thorough review of previous NEPA practices, the first Trump administration analyzed 656 environmental impact statements, or EISs, published between 2013 and 2018. The review found that on average, an EIS was 575 pages long and took 4.5 years to complete, with a quarter of them taking over 6 years to complete. According to a study from the Breakthrough Institute, NEPA-related litigation on EISs takes an average of 4.2 years to resolve, and environmental non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, were involved in 75% of NEPA claims. H.R. 573 would coalesce prior data collection and reporting efforts into a single report published annually by CEQ on NEPA litigation, timelines, and page length. Reinstating these reports will help identify NEPA bottlenecks. Next, we have H.R. 4503, the ePermit Act, introduced by Representatives Johnson of South Dakota and Peters of California. Today's technology landscape for federal permitting consists of diverse and isolated systems spread across different federal agencies. Generally, these systems are not interoperable or sufficiently accessible for project sponsors and the general public. To address these issues, the Trump administration issued a memorandum titled Updating Permitting Technology for the 21st Century, and CEQ then issued a Permitting Technology Action Plan, which sets the foundation for seamless information exchange between agencies, simplified interactions for applicants, and greater transparency and predictability on environmental review and permitting schedules for project sponsors and stakeholders. The ePermit Act codifies key aspects of CEQ's action plan and directs federal agencies on how to implement electronic permitting systems. It also instructs CEQ to work with other agencies to establish a unified interagency data system for environmental permitting and to integrate AI into agencies' permitting processes. Also on today's agenda is H.R. 4776, the SPEED Act, which I look forward to discussing in greater depth later in this hearing. For now, I'll simply say this. Over the years, we have passed different pieces of legislation that usually include funding for different projects and purposes, which are then celebrated and lauded in D.C. But what always happens afterwards? The projects themselves can't be permitted because Congress has shied away from addressing permitting reform head-on. We have said this several times in this committee, but our broken permitting system isn't just holding back our economy, it's threatening our national security and that of our allies. The cost of inaction are too high, so the time to advance bipartisan permitting reform is now. With that, I look forward to hearing testimony from some of today's leading experts on these bills, and I'll now recognize Ranking Member Huffman for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I do have two unanimous consent requests. The first is Chapter 5 of a pretty old document here. This is the first report from the Council on Environmental Quality to Congress from August of 1970, and it includes a chapter on climate change. I think that's significant.
Without objection.
Thank you. The second is also from the 70s. This is a 1977 report to Congress from the Comptroller General of the United States, and it's about U.S. coal development. On page 6.19, there's a significant quote there. It says, with continued growth in the use of fossil fuels, the effect of increased coal combustion on climatic conditions may become an important problem during the next 50 years. There's a lot to listen to here, Mr. Chairman, and this is not new.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Chairman, today we have three bills on the agenda relating to NEPA. Two of them, H.R. 573 and H.R. 4503, aim to enhance data collection and use, and I especially want to thank Representatives Johnson and Peters for their work on the e-permitting bill. There's a lot of bipartisan work that we can do in this space to leverage modern tools and data to improve the permitting process, and those bills are good examples of that. But when we get into the third bill on the agenda, Mr. Chairman, it's your bill, the so-called SPEED Act. This is where the conversation takes a hard turn. In the name of speed, or is it greed, this legislation takes a sledgehammer to NEPA's core functions, the very things that help keep communities safe, that keep projects accountable, and protect our environment. NEPA's purpose is very simple. Before the federal government greenlights a project with major environmental impacts that could transform landscapes or communities for generations, it has to consider the facts. It has to disclose major environmental and public health impacts, and it has to engage the public that will have to live with the results of that action. Now, let me say that speed can be great when you're headed in the right direction. But if you are recklessly speeding down the road without working brakes or steering or headlights, obviously that's a wreck waiting to happen, and that's exactly what the SPEED Act would invite. The SPEED Act treats public input like it is an annoyance, like a hurdle, rather than a resource that can guide better decisions. It restricts what major environmental impacts can even be considered for review. It eliminates the spotlight that NEPA provides for the public to help government get it right. And by shrinking analysis and compressing timelines without investing in greater agency permitting capacity, you're really just inviting shoddy analysis, and ultimately that's going to lead to more litigation and uncertainty. Let's not forget that Congress recently made the most significant amendments to NEPA in a generation, not to mention the major court action, administrative action, and regulatory action that we have seen on NEPA in recent months. Agencies, communities, and developers alike haven't even had a chance to see how those changes are working. So it makes no sense to blindly rush in with another round of sweeping changes before we've even measured the results of all of these other changes. And that brings me to a larger point about process. Mr. Chairman, if you and I were sitting down with stakeholders, trying to truly understand the challenges that they're facing, and I'm talking about developers, communities, tribes, labor, conservationists, we could probably identify where reasonable consensus exists for reforms. I actually think we could. That's how you get durable bipartisan solutions, and it's exactly what so many of today's witnesses have been calling for, but that hasn't happened here. Instead, we're holding a hearing on a bill designed to deliver for one set of interests while shutting everyone else out. And the good news on the permitting front is that we can maintain NEPA's core protections and speed the process up. And obviously, one of the most effective and proven ways to do that is to ensure we have properly staffed and trained federal permitting offices to process applications. I mean, that's just obvious. That's why Democrats funded $1 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to do exactly that. It was working. The Biden administration cut the time it takes to complete an EIS by 8 months, 23% faster than the first Trump administration. And in 2024, the median time to complete an EIS was down to just over 2 years. That means it wasn't holding back most major projects. But Republicans just rescinded most of these unspecified or unspent funds, and the administration's DOGE efforts and indiscriminate firings at key permitting agencies, they've just made things worse. And if that wasn't enough, the administration also repealed CEQ's unifying NEPA regulations, and that throws out the unified playbook that helps guide federal agencies and has done so for agencies and developers for decades. All of this leaves me with the question, who is this legislation actually for? Because it's definitely not tribes whose sacred land is at risk of being desecrated. It's not impacted communities that are worried about toxic projects that could irreversibly pollute where they live. It's certainly not hardworking everyday folks being pummeled by the insane cost of living who are desperate for more affordable electricity. It's crystal clear that this legislation is for corporate polluters and big oil donors so they can keep padding their pockets at the expense of all of these other stakeholders in the rest of the country. This country, the people of the United States, deserve better. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I will begin our member panel to allow bill sponsors to speak on their legislation, and I now recognize Mr. Rudy Yakym from Indiana for his testimony on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for providing me with the opportunity to testify in support of my bill, H.R. 573, the Studying NEPA's Impact on Projects Act, which I introduced with my good friend, Mr. Jimmy Panetta of California. This bill will require the White House Council on Economic Quality, or CEQ, to publish and submit to Congress an annual report that highlights the the litigation and paperwork burdens imposed by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA has strayed far from its original purpose of environmental protection. Instead, it has become a bit of a four-letter word, often weaponized to bog down infrastructure, housing, energy, and other critical projects in burdensome regulation and red tape. My bill would require the CEQ to report on NEPA's impact on these projects, from delays due to litigation and bureaucracy to the length of reports and the cost to taxpayers and project sponsors to ultimately clear this project. This information has been compiled in separate reports in the past, either on an annual or an ad hoc basis. Very simply, H.R. 573 revives and combines these individual reports into a single annual report. The annual report will provide us with a formal, regular update in order to conduct oversight, ensure accountability, and identify areas in need of reform. The consequences of NEPA are felt across the economy, from manufacturing and construction in my district, to the lack of forest management in Mr. LaMalfa's district, to stagnating mining operations in Mr. Stauber's district. The massive regulatory costs associated with NEPA also hamper our ability to compete with China, which dominates global critical mineral supply chains, even though we have some of the most mineral-rich territory on Earth right here in the United States. A recent report found that energy projects across all fuel types spent a median of 3 years between final agency approval and a final court decision, with some taking decades. I commend what the Trump administration has done to overhaul NEPA, specifically reducing project timelines. I look forward to locking in these reforms and passing H.R. 573 to ensure that we have accountability moving forward. The Studying NEPA's Project Impact on Projects Act is an important step in our work to continue reforming the permitting process. It's time to get the government and frivolous litigation out of the way of hardworking Americans who just simply want to make America build again. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Dusty Johnson, for his testimony on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for taking up my bill, the ePermit Act, today. Most all thoughtful people seem to acknowledge that the way we do siting and permitting in this country needs some pretty serious improvement. A lot of independent analyses indicate that we have the most onerous siting and permitting within the developed world. We do have an opportunity on a bipartisan basis to make improvements. We've done some of that, but I think we have a lot more to do. And I'm excited that in the Westerman-Huffman era, we can get a lot of that done. I think most of us realize that our current environment, our current landscape for permitting and siting does not deliver on time and on task. So often the delays with this siting are not actually linked to environmental protection. It's not that there's a holdup as we do serious and important analysis about protecting our key resources or assets. It's just that we don't really have our act together. So we don't really know how to share, transfer, and analyze the information that are before us. I think modern technology gives us a real opportunity to solve those problems. So where are we at today? So often multiple agencies, of course, are involved in this siting. And the way they are exchanging information is antiquated. It is hard to imagine that they are still sharing individual PDFs that can get lost in people's email, that they need to package them together, send them to somebody else. Well, do they really have them? I don't know. That rudimentary process, it reduces people's ability to understand what is really going on with permitting and what really needs to happen next. The ePermit Act addresses those problems by establishing a framework for agencies to implement a digital permitting system and a unified portal. Again, this is just about us as a federal government handling the information, handling the data in a fundamentally more modern way. This is not a new concept. On a bipartisan basis, we have said these words before. In the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, Congress acknowledged the potential for digital solutions and required the Council on Environmental Quality to study how to actually move this ball downfield. In April, President Trump showed good leadership in advancing that cause, telling his agencies that they did need to begin to put this together. And indeed, shortly after, CEQ issued a comprehensive permitting technology action plan to try to get a government-wide strategy for making this happen. So the ePermit Act just builds on those efforts, the congressional efforts of 2023, the executive efforts of this year, to provide legislative clarity and direction on how agencies should build out this and operate this digital permitting system. This is basic. None of this there's no boogeyman here. This is about establishing federal data standards so all agencies speak the same language, and this is about having a government-wide permitting portal so that we've got a one-stop shop for this really important project information. This is an important piece of legislation, and I want to thank my partners in this effort. Scott Peters and his team, especially his team is way better than Peters. But they have been, no, of course, leadership comes from the top, and they've asked the right questions. They've wanted to make sure that we had a work product that was going to add value and wasn't just politics. Like, let's actually do our job and actually make this country better. I also want to thank CEQ and our stakeholder partners for their essential input. Of course, Mr. Harrell from ClearPath, who is providing testimony today. Teamwork makes the dream work, as they say. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. I look forward to working with the committee to pass our bill so that we can get America building again. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for testimony on my bill, the Speed Act. And when this committee met in July to discuss NEPA, some were saying that and contended that NEPA no longer poses any serious problems. They claimed that the statute's notorious delays are a thing of the past, citing various reforms from the FRA and a report issued in the waning days of the Biden administration. While witness testimony during the July hearing revealed how the previous administration altered key data to make NEPA timelines seem shorter, the Trump administration has made significant progress in ensuring that the FRA timelines are met. Still, projects across nearly all sectors reflecting the priorities of congressional Republicans and Democrats remain mired in NEPA's red tape. Congress must act quickly to relieve this NEPA logjam and get our nation building again. During the July hearing, we submitted for the record the environmental impact statement that was at issue in the recent Supreme Court case, 7-County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County. This environmental impact statement was over 3,600 pages long, but some still claimed it wasn't expansive enough. While the FRA did impose EIS page limits, NEPA must be further reformed to put definitive guardrails around what agencies are expected to review. Much like the review documents themselves, the NEPA litigation has gotten out of control. NEPA is the most frequently litigated environmental statute, and NEPA-related litigation on an EIS takes an average of 4.2 years to resolve. Without changes, bureaucratic reviews and endless litigation will continue unabated. Environmental documents will again explode in length, and our nation's ability to build and maintain its critical infrastructure will continue to deteriorate. But let me make something clear. Better process for NEPA means better environmental results. For example, from this report, it talks about something that's very dear and near to me, and that's forest management. And this says a forest restoration project was held up for nearly a decade by NEPA and other environmental reviews in Grizzly Flats, California. In 2021, 2/3 of the community burned before the project was complete. There's a whole list of examples, and I ask unanimous consent to submit this to the record, in which we see failure to act on permitting resulted in poor outcomes for the environment. We can do better than that. In H.R. 4776, the Standardizing, Permitting, Expediting Economic Development Act, or the SPEED Act, is a bipartisan piece of legislation that introduced with Congressman Golden to address these issues in a targeted manner to benefit all kinds of projects and to benefit the environment. The bill clarifies that agencies may consider environmental effects that are approximately caused by major federal actions and may not consider effects that are speculative or separate in time or place from the project in question. The language codifies pieces of the 7-county decision while providing clarity to agencies and courts as what effects should be considered. This will reduce document length, project timelines, and frivolous litigation. The bill also clarifies the definition of a major federal action by establishing once and for all that the agencies may not determine an action to be subject to NEPA based solely on the provision of federal funding. The provision will not only provide certainty to the regulated community, it will also provide fewer environmental reviews, thus freeing up agency resources for projects that are actually under their control. Lastly, the bill tackles frivolous litigation under NEPA in several ways. Importantly, the legislation aligns judicial remedies under NEPA with the fact that the statute is purely procedural, a point that has been emphasized in multiple Supreme Court decisions. The bill achieves this by stating that courts cannot block projects solely because of a procedural mistake. The bill also requires claims to be filed within 150 days of the final action, and each claimant to have meaningfully participated in the public comment process. Claimants also must prove that they will be directly harmed by the project or action in question. These reforms will prevent litigants from surprising agencies with claims and will limit judicial abuse by special interest groups while protecting the process of permitting. Ultimately, this legislation will restore NEPA to its original purpose. It is project neutral and will add certainty to permitting processes across sectors. Whether you're a community fixing aging infrastructure, an energy company building to power the AI revolution, or a federal land manager working to improve the health of our nation's forest, the SPEED Act will modernize and streamline NEPA's processes for you. That is why nearly 100 organizations from across the U.S., representing industry, labor, state, local, and tribal governments, among others, all support the legislation. I appreciate the robust bipartisan support for the legislation, and I look forward to further discussion and testimony on the bill. We'll now begin our second panel of witnesses. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button on the microphone. We do use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will allow the witnesses to testify before we have member questioning. Our first witness of this panel is Mr. Thomas Hockman. He is the Director of Infrastructure Policy of the Foundation for American Innovation, and he is stationed in Washington, D.C. Mr. Hockman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Thomas Hockman, and I'm the Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Foundation for American Innovation. For decades, a growing chorus of voices, Democrats and Republicans, environmentalists and industrialists, labor unions, and business leaders, have identified our permitting process as one of the greatest barriers to American prosperity. And yet, more than 50 years after NEPA's passage, we have largely failed to fix it. Today, there's more pressure on our outdated processes than ever before. The U.S. needs massive expansions in grid capacity to handle new energy generation. We need domestic mining and refining to break China's chokehold on critical minerals. And we need the power and the infrastructure for the data centers that will decide who leads in artificial intelligence. To take just one example, a leading AI company estimates that the U.S. AI sector will need a whopping 50 gigawatts of new electric capacity by 2028. Yet NEPA and related processes have constrained our ability to add and move electricity. From 2010 to 2020, about a quarter of new transmission line miles required full environmental impact statements, the most burdensome level of NEPA review, which takes an average of more than 4 years for transmission projects. Interregional lines, most likely to trigger NEPA, have fallen to nearly 0 per year. And of course, the queue of new energy projects waiting to connect to the grid is overwhelmingly low carbon, meaning delays hurt low carbon projects the most. And this is the crux of the issue. NEPA does not mandate an environmental outcome. It mandates a process. Substantive environmental protections live in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the RCRA, and elsewhere. In 1969, before those regimes matured, NEPA's procedural overlay may have been the best tool available, but that is no longer the world that we live in. That's why Representatives Westerman and Golden's SPEED Act is so important. It right-sizes NEPA for the challenges of the 21st century while preserving public input and environmental review. First, it clarifies what counts as a major federal action. Over time, agencies and courts have treated almost everything as major, dragging everything from federal hiring to picnics into the NEPA process. Fortunately, the SPEED Act states that federal funding by itself doesn't automatically trigger NEPA. That matters a great deal, as today, cities and project sponsors often defederalize to avoid NEPA's delay and cost, walking away from sorely needed federal dollars. Second, the Act focuses the scope of NEPA review on effects proximately caused by the project under consideration. The Supreme Court's recent unanimous 7-county decision made the same point. Agencies should not be forced to analyze speculative effects thousands of miles away. Third, and most important, the Act improves judicial review. It instructs courts not to set aside a NEPA review unless an agency abused its discretion, restoring NEPA's hard look standard as a check on reasoned decision-making, rather than a license for endless judicial nitpicking. It also sets an 150-day statute of limitations, far saner than the current 6 years, bringing certainty to projects that have already cleared review. And it requires litigants to have participated and raised specific issues in public comment, aligning NEPA with common sense standards used in other environmental laws. Crucially, none of this eliminates the core thrust of NEPA. Environmental impact statements still require public comment. Project opponents can still bring lawsuits. Agencies still must take a hard look. The SPEED Act simply restores balance, so reviews end, decisions stick, and harmless procedural missteps don't derail nationally important infrastructure years after a record of decision. Pairing these reforms with better data is the goal of the bipartisan Studying NEPA's Impact on Projects Act. Despite NEPA's enormous footprint in our economy, we lack basic information about the effects of the law. CEQ reports on timelines have been sporadic and thin. Litigation data are scattered. And we know even less about environmental assessments. This bill would fix that. It requires annual standardized reporting on NEPA litigation, page counts, and costs, so policymakers can see where the system breaks down. And critically, it requires CEQ to track NEPA timelines from application to submission to decision, capturing the pre-NEPA period that often adds years to the process but is rarely studied. Taken together, the SPEED Act and the Studying NEPA's Impact on Projects Act keep what the public values: transparency, comment, environmental analysis, while restoring what the nation needs: the ability to build. If we want reliable power, secure supply chains, competitive AI, and healthier forests, we cannot afford a process that routinely turns into a decade-long paperwork and litigation gauntlet. I urge Congress to pass both bills. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The gentleman yields back. I appreciate your testimony. We'll now move on to our next witness, Mr. Nick Loris. He is the Executive Vice President of Policy of C3 Solutions, and he is stationed in Washington, D.C. Mr. Loris, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Huffman, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Nick Loris, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Policy at the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. C3 Solutions is a think tank dedicated to accelerating innovation to meet our energy needs and our greatest environmental challenges. In the need to innovate, invest, and build for a cleaner, more prosperous future, time is far from a neutral variable. It can be a competitive advantage or a competitive disadvantage, depending on what you're building and where you're building it. Permitting reform will create more opportunities where investing and building in America is a competitive advantage, enabling us to meet our energy needs, our infrastructure needs, as well as our environmental ambitions. In nearly every sector of the economy, there is a clear and urgent need to increase supply. Across the U.S., electricity prices are more than twice the inflation rate, and supply must rapidly expand to meet rising demand. Demand from data centers alone could double by 2030, requiring roughly 6 times the power that New York City consumes today. We need more critical minerals, which are essential for producing clean, affordable energy, defense systems, and the modern technologies that we rely on daily. We also need infrastructure with resilient supply chains to keep grocery stores stocked with food, hospitals supplied with medicine, and to connect American businesses with consumers around the world. We must invest in and actively manage America's natural ecosystems. Currently, the Forest Service faces an 80 million acre backlog requiring restoration, and 63 million acres are at high or very high risk of wildfires. Prescribed burns, timber harvesting, and deploying advanced technologies will significantly reduce the economic and environmental costs that wildfires inflict on communities. Whether it is a solar array on federal lands, a new rail project, or a prescribed burn, these projects can face burdensome permitting processes and excessive litigation. While many regulatory reforms are necessary at the federal, state, and local levels, one law in urgent need of modernization is the National Environmental Policy Act. A well-intentioned look-before-you-leap statute, NEPA has devolved into paralysis by analysis, inviting protracted legal battles. A more thorough reviews and litigation significantly extend timelines, raise costs, and heighten uncertainty. In fact, just the threat of litigation increases timelines as risk-averse agencies seek to protect themselves against lawsuits. Anecdotal evidence and agency-wide data from NEPA reviews support these claims. Several studies in recent years have documented that the average time to prepare an environmental impact statement is over 4 years. And these lengthier processes disproportionately hinder the development of clean energy. A 2023 study by the R Street Institute reviewed EISs conducted by the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Land Management. The analysis found DOE had twice as many clean energy projects requiring EISs as fossil fuels, while BLM projects had nearly 4 times the number of clean energy projects compared to fossil fuels. Litigation also adds average delay of roughly 4 years, as solar, transmission, and wind energy projects face some of the highest rates of litigation. Forest management projects can be delayed by years, threatening the ability to protect communities and critical habitats. Now, measuring the total costs of an outdated bureaucratic permitting process is challenging. There are some projects that could have saved forests, lowered energy bills, and reduced emissions that just never happened and are still delayed for years, if not decades. But there are clear benefits from permitting reform to highlight today. A more transparent and consistent process that narrows the scope of reviews, prevents agencies from having to consider endless what-ifs, and delivers on judicial reform will help provide American companies with the certainty they need to innovate, invest, and build. Leveraging technology will help modernize, simplify, and expedite the process, which benefits project developers and agencies alike. Along with creating shovel-ready jobs and injecting capital into the U.S. economy, American families will benefit from more affordable power, a more resilient grid, and dependable infrastructure. Critically, permitting reform gives us more bites at the apple to reap the substantial economic and environmental spillovers from innovation. We don't know what the next fracking revolution in the United States might look like, whether it's super hot geothermal, small modular reactors, long-duration battery storage, or likely some combination thereof. But whatever it might be, strict permitting requirements create higher barriers to entry for transformative, potentially game-changing technologies. Red tape shouldn't stand in the way of cost declines and wide-scale deployment. Permitting reform is not about eliminating the need to engage and consult with communities and tribes, but empowering them and addressing their concerns while cutting through the redundancies, the box checking, and the bureaucracy. Permitting reform is not about lowering the standards for environmental safeguards. It's about enabling developers to meet those standards more quickly, thereby addressing America's energy, infrastructure, and conservation needs. In conclusion, with bipartisan, bicameral interest in permitting reform, it is an opportune moment for a policy realignment that focuses on building rather than blocking. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Loris, thank you for your testimony. Our next witness is Mr. Robert Glicksman. He is the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law at the George Washington University Law School, and he is stationed here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Glicksman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Huffman, for the opportunity to testify today. I am the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. I base both my oral and written testimony, which reflect only my own views, on my experience teaching environmental law for nearly 45 years, and on my scholarship on NEPA, which includes being the lead co-author on the leading legal treatise on the statute. I will speak today to the SPEED Act. Congress enacted NEPA on a bipartisan basis in 1970 to prevent avoidable but irreversible environmental mistakes. It was premised on the sound rationale that it's foolish to proceed in darkness when it's possible to discover foreseeable harms in time to avoid them, instead of later engaging in hand-wringing about disasters that could have been foreseen or not because of short-sightedness, impatience, and lack of concern about environmental risks. The SPEED Act seems to forget that origin story. But even if Congress is intent on revising NEPA, this is the wrong time to do it. Congress made major changes in NEPA in the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, and the Supreme Court recently shifted judicial review toward greater deference to agencies in their NEPA preparations. It would make more sense to step back to evaluate the impact of these developments before rewriting the statute again, especially in the fashion called for by this bill. The SPEED Act does not streamline NEPA. Instead, it strips NEPA of what makes it work. It leaves the statute on the books so that it appears to be a functioning environmental assessment regime when, in fact, it hollows it out. It reduces incentives to develop information on environmental effects by all stakeholders and enables agencies to proceed in darkness, even when it's possible to learn about foreseeable harms in time to avoid them. The inevitable consequence of this legislation would be the acceleration of inadequately vetted projects and an increase in the risk of unforeseen, unintended, and adverse impacts. My written testimony centers on 4 categories of problematic provisions in the SPEED Act, which I described there in more detail than I'm able to do this morning. First, the bill narrows the scope of NEPA's application by allowing government agencies to avoid NEPA procedures entirely, notwithstanding their environmentally damaging potential. An example is the provision redefining the term major federal action to exclude loans, grants, or other forms of federal financial assistance unless the federal agency providing that assistance exercises complete control and responsibility over the effect of the action. The retention by non-governmental actors of artificially created discretion over minor aspects of project implementation shouldn't matter. Another objectionable provision would require an agency's purpose and needs statement to meet a private project proponent's goals. This turns NEPA on its head by displacing considerations of whether a project promotes the public interest with whether it satisfies the narrow, self-interested objectives of private project proponents. Second, the SPEED Act allows agencies to make their NEPA determinations in ignorance by limiting public input into the NEPA process and allowing agencies to ignore related information made available to them by informed stakeholders. Telling agencies to ignore new scientific data once an application for a pedal permit is filed is senseless. Doing so not only punishes communities and experts who invest in generating the information, but also rewards decision-making in ignorance, a result directly contrary to NEPA's goals. Until an agency receives an application to approve private development, it has little reason to undertake research. The application describes the parameters of the project, revealing for the first time the kinds of environmental risks posed by agency approval. That's precisely the time when agencies should be engaged in gathering information about the environmental risks posed by a project. Third, the SPEED Act would block access to the courts by those adversely affected by decision-making that occurs in violation of NEPA procedural requirements. For example, it would block challenges to the adoption of categorical exclusions, which authorize avoidance of all NEPA analysis. Fourth, the SPEED Act would shackle courts in the kinds of relief they can provide, even when they do find statutory violations. Most disturbingly, by barring courts from enjoining projects pending compliance with the statute, the bill would eliminate agency incentives to take their NEPA responsibilities seriously. Regardless of how sloppy or incomplete their NEPA analyses are, they will suffer no adverse consequences if a court finds that violations have occurred. In conclusion, now is not the right time to amend NEPA, and the SPEED Act is not the right way to do it. Thank you.
Mr. Glicksman, thank you for your testimony. Our final witness of this panel is Mr. Jeremy Harrell. He is the CEO of ClearPath Action, and he is stationed in Washington, D.C. Mr. Harrell, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the committee. My name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ClearPath Action. America stands at an inflection point of unprecedented energy demand, fueled by a revival of American manufacturing, advances in artificial intelligence, and breakthroughs in quantum computing. We're in a race with China in each of these areas. This presents new challenges, but also immense opportunities for our country to build big and win. The Trump administration has set some ambitious goals: to build 300 gigawatts of new nuclear power, to lead the world in AI development, to pioneer new space-based technologies and exploration, and to expand supply chains in strategic sectors like critical minerals and shipbuilding. Permitting bottlenecks threaten all of these goals and the affordable power that your constituents expect. In the face of skyrocketing demand growth, building more energy resources has become more urgent. The data shows we're falling behind. For example, China added 475 gigawatts of new electricity generation in 2024. Meanwhile, the US added just 1/10 of that. China built 74 gigawatts of new energy storage. The US built 10. China built 54 gigawatts of new fossil fuel generation, primarily unmitigated coal. The US built just 2 gigawatts of lower emission gas. By every metric, China is building more energy than we are, and that energy is fueling growth across their economy. We have to keep up. The US and China dominate global data centers, accounting for 70% of total installed capacity worldwide. As China further develops their own domestic capacity, they will sell even more of their products globally. Chinese manufacturing output exceeded $4.5 trillion last year, more than a quarter of global production. The clearest path for Congress to give the US a leg up in this competition is bipartisan permitting reform. Modernized permitting will unlock Americans' abundant natural resources, scale new clean energy, build the transmission and pipelines needed to move energy nationwide, and bring manufacturing home, where our environmental standards are stronger than China's. But our current regulatory system is not only unpredictable, it is standing in the way of our nation's energy, climate, and economic development goals at the federal, state, and local level. And these challenges are present in every sector of the economy, from energy to housing to transportation. A winning future requires step change reform, not just tweaks around the edges, while also balancing speed, safety, and community engagement. Bipartisan congressional action, reforms that dramatically increase efficiency today and are politically durable into the future, can flip the script and put America back in a leadership position. Accordingly, this committee should focus on 3 key areas. 1, modernizing NEPA. For half a century, NEPA remained largely untouched by Congress. This allowed presidents and the courts to stack burdensome and duplicative processes on top of what Congress originally intended. NEPA is a procedural law that requires federal agencies to assess the environmental impact of their actions, not one that imposes substantive new requirements. Congress made a down payment in the Fiscal Responsibility Act to refocus NEPA reviews, but Congress must now build on these bipartisan reforms to deliver an efficient and predictable process for all projects. 2, reforming judicial review and litigation practices. The judicial review process for energy projects has become an obstacle to timely completion. Developers navigating through a lengthy permitting process face additional delays due to litigation, injunctions, and appeals that can drag on for years, costing time and money with little to no environmental benefit. Meanwhile, China keeps on building. And 3, increasing transparency. The private sector uses technology to track projects and to keep stakeholders informed. The federal government should too. We need to end the old school siloed approach that creates bottlenecks and use new tools developed by private industry and our national labs. We must do better to keep developers and the public informed. To that end, ClearPath Action is proud to support the 3 bipartisan bills before the committee today, because they take significant steps to deliver accountability and accelerate the permitting process. In conclusion, the window of opportunity for Congress to deliver effective permitting reform is now. The combination of recent Supreme Court decisions, executive orders, and new national security imperatives showcase the desperate need for new congressional action immediately. The U.S. is in a global competition for energy, for AI, and for manufacturing leadership. We cannot win without being able to build here at home. Congress alone can provide the long-term certainty developers need to make billion-dollar investment decisions in our country. To let America win, we need to let America build. Thank you.
Mr. Harrell, thank you for your testimony, and again, thank all the witnesses for your testimony. We'll now move on to member questions. I will recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, and I'll begin with the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to thank our witnesses today. And Mr. Hoekman, I want to, let me first start. I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter into the record the article about Mr. Hoekman published in Green Tape titled NEPA Stats.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Hoekman, in that article, you cite some extremely high costs that are associated with categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements. And I think we've all heard horror stories of those. From the U.S. Forest Service, over $50,000 for each categorical exclusion, $200,000 for each environmental assessment. In places like the Department of Energy, $6 million or more for environmental impact statements, and the list goes on and on. We all know, too, that timelines have a big impact on construction projects. We see that not only have costs tripled, but time has increased significantly. U.S. transit infrastructure projects have increased by 3 times the amount of time that it takes to get things approved, 3 times higher than our competitors around the world. So they're improving their infrastructure while we struggle. You cite one stat there that says 14% or more of 350 major infrastructure projects from 2010 to 2018 were outright canceled. That's probably why President Obama mentioned with the stimulus package there weren't quite as many shovel-ready projects as they had anticipated, because shovel-ready requires approval to actually be able to execute those projects. And when you can't because of timelines and these outrageous costs, and all of a sudden the economics of these projects becomes untenable, then they move by the wayside. So we can't complain on one side that we're falling behind in infrastructure and say on the other side that our administrative processes are actually leading us to that. With this in mind, Mr. Hoekman, I want you to speak a little bit about the environmental impacts and the changes in both federal government and industries building out in American infrastructure have on what we're able to do as a country, and also the timeline delays and what that does to the things that we need to do as a nation.
Representative, thank you for the question. Yeah, President Obama's regulatory czar said about the permitting process, if it were a supervillain, it would be the Blob. And that's, I think what we're dealing with here. Our permitting process touches every sector of the economy, right? Whether it's the readiness of our defense industrial base, right? The defense industrial base needs an enormous amount of energy. NEPA gets in the way of our ability to deploy energy generation, energy transmission, our ability to move electrons around the country. It gets in the way of our environmental protection. I mean, I know that this committee has talked quite a bit about forest fire protection. And certainly we've seen case after case of the NEPA review process slowing our ability to respond to the threats of wildfires. So whether it be environmental protection, our defense readiness, or just the growth of the economy, the permitting process touches every sector of the economy.
Thank you. I want to reference to a book that's come out. The book is entitled Abundance by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. It speaks at length about how this nation has abundance. And by the way, both of those authors are very liberal in their ideology, but have said that the permitting process is broken. It holds this country back, that there needs to be massive changes to that, fundamental changes to that process. And then a lot of members of Congress, too, are very interested in funding projects back in their district, now called community project funding. Community project funding, in many instances, not only requires the money, it requires the permitting, and many times, too, it requires additional dollars to get through the environmental impact statement assessments, both at the federal, state, and local level. Can you give us your projections about how NEPA affects those sorts of projects and how those projects can be executed? Because it's great to go home and say, hey, listen, I got money for the project. But when you wait a decade to get the project done and your constituents are going, wait a minute, you said you funded this project. What the heck is going on? Give us your perspective on how NEPA affects that.
Yeah, before this committee, just a few months ago, somebody from the American Public Works Administration said that they would try to avoid federal dollars by any means necessary because of the red tape that came along with those dollars. And you see this term of art, which is called defederalization, which cities and towns use, where they basically try to get rid of the federal dollars so they don't have to go through the NEPA process, even though in many cases those federal dollars are sorely needed. So yeah, I would say that, the SPEED Act's provision that says that federal financial assistance itself shall not be sufficient to trigger NEPA is a really critical response to this problem.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
When his time's expired, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Ansari, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. This is undoubtedly a very important topic. We should absolutely expedite the responsible build-out of 21st century infrastructure, including clean energy, which is necessary to combat the climate crisis and stabilize our energy prices. Although I strongly oppose the SPEED Act, I can appreciate the chairman's attempt to be technology neutral on this front. But while the chairman might be, this administration is not. This administration has clearly demonstrated that it does not support wind and solar, calling them unreliable, saying they don't work, and even calling them ugly. But this is not where the American people are on this issue. The American people recognize that the climate crisis is real, and they believe that true energy independence will be achieved through homegrown, clean energy developed through American innovation and built by our union workforce. So I just want to clarify a couple of points. Mr. Harrell, do you believe that with good grid management and things like battery storage, that wind and solar can be a reliable source of electricity? Yes or no?
We absolutely should be investing in all sources of clean energy to develop a reliable energy system to meet our needs.
Thank you. Mr. Hochman, do you believe that with good grid management and things like battery storage, that wind and solar can be a reliable source of electricity?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Loris?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with renewables, what we've heard is they're reliably unreliable. And so with the proper storage or whether it's natural gas, we can have a system with low-cost clean energy generation, including wind and solar.
Thank you. Great. I agree. The administration officials who have come here before us so far seem to forget that batteries do exist. But I'll move on. Mr. Harrell, do you agree that fully permitted and reviewed energy projects, let's use offshore wind as an example, that are mere months away from providing affordable, reliable power to the electricity grid should be allowed to finish construction? Yes or no?
Absolutely. We need a predictable regulatory process.
Thank you. Mr. Hochman?
Yeah, I support making it easier to bring new electrons onto the grid.
Thank you. And Mr. Loris?
Yeah, I do. I think the use of both preemptive vetoes and retroactive vetoes has been problematic and creates a lot of uncertainty in our ability to invest and build all types of energy sources.
Thank you. It is great and so refreshing to hear your support for offshore wind. And let me say, what the Trump administration is doing right now to clean energy is unprecedented. It will result in more expensive energy bills for American families, more pollution, and a climate crisis that's worsening by the day. This administration has not stopped at one-stop work order. They've been yanking permits, requiring secretary-level sign-off for mundane permitting decisions, canceling loans and grants for clean energy-related infrastructure projects in red and blue states alike. They're also requiring agencies to consider so-called energy density and more arbitrary attacks. Just to make sure that we are clear on what's going on here, we have 3 Republican invited witnesses who agree that renewable energy like wind and solar is reliable, is affordable, and that this administration, this is my view, is out of line with that. And yet no one on the other side of the aisle seems to be willing to stand up and to refute the outrageous claims of the Trump administration and the full-scale attack on clean energy and affordability for Americans. It's outrageous. And I will just say, I don't see anything in this bill that will move the needle and help these clean energy projects move forward. If we want to have a serious conversation about permitting, we cannot ignore the elephant in the room. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Huffman for holding this hearing today. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. My question is for Mr. Harrell. In your testimony, you emphasized the need for multiple sources of energy production in order to keep up with China. Can you go over in more detail how important our energy production is from a national security standpoint? And in your opinion, is the United States, as it is now, on the right track to compete with China and other less than friendly global players? If not, what do we need to do to catch up?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I do not think the U.S. is on track. I think we have an opportunity to correct course. We need to establish a more predictable regulatory process to build out all sources of energy to meet our needs. As mentioned, 70% of, for example, data center capacity is being deployed in the U.S. In China. We're in a direct race there. The U.S. It put more capacity on over the last year, but we have a risk that we could lose that advantage. And so bipartisan, politically durable reforms that provide predictability for all energy sources is critical. And I think the SPEED Act actually does do that. I think the SPEED Act takes a technology agnostic approach that would allow us to have predictability in the regulatory system for all new energy sources.
Mr. Hochman, Mr. Loris, you also briefly mentioned China and Russia in your testimonies. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, Representative, I would, I would agree with Mr. Harrell's sentiments here. It's, particularly for AI and data centers, we know that the pace of demand for being able to power these, best of the best AI models is going up dramatically, and it's going up fast. While Anthropic is saying that we need 50 gigawatts of new AI electricity by 2028, our 2 most recent nuclear plants took 16 years, and those were just 2 gigawatts, right, to bring onto the grid. And so the size of the delta here is enormous. And one of the huge problems here is the pace of our permitting process.
And I'll just quickly add, we are an energy abundant nation. We have an entrepreneurial spirit. We have world-class talent and companies here that develop conventional energy sources and clean energy sources, and a lot of innovation happening here. But we need this permitting reform to help keep pace. It's incredible what the United States has done as an energy superpowerhouse in terms of our ability to supply affordable, reliable energy, in terms of our ability to help our allies with things like liquefied natural gas exports. But China is racing ahead in all sorts of these technologies, including AI. And so we can't have permitting be the bottleneck that holds up our opportunities to innovate, invest, and build.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Mr. Huffman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their candor in answering the questions that my colleague from Arizona just asked about, frankly, the chaos this administration is inflicting on all types of clean energy. And it really highlights just the cognitive dissonance of this entire conversation that we're pretending to have in this sham hearing where Republicans claim they want to move projects forward. They want to bring more energy to the American people, while an entire industry is being shut down because of these wrong-headed actions, singling out a battery manufacturing facility for an immigration enforcement raid, shutting down an offshore wind project that's nearly complete, that's going to bring the cheapest electricity to New England that's available out there, sending the entire regional grid into chaos, pulling back port modernization grants that have already been awarded that are going to bring thousands of jobs and clean, affordable energy to the West Coast and other places. This is madness, and what we get from the other side is crickets and gaslighting with bills like this. This is not normal. This is not okay. But I do want to talk about what would happen if this particular piece of legislation, the SPEED Act, were somehow to become law. So, Mr. Glickman, I want to ask you a few things. Effective permitting reform is obviously impossible if President Trump and the administration continue to try to kill off all clean energy. But with the SPEED Act, in just a few words, can you remind us why Congress often includes mechanisms for judicial review when it passes all sorts of laws? Why is this an important policy?
It's an important policy to ensure accountability to the American people in terms of what government agencies do. The Supreme Court has often recognized what it calls a presumption of reviewability. That is, that we assume that government actions by administrative agencies, are reviewable in court to make sure that the agencies are acting in accordance with the statutes pursuant to which they have power to act in the first place. We don't want them running astray, and it's the courts that provide an essential function in making sure that agencies are held responsible for exceeding the scope of their authority.
All right, thanks. So let's go to Section 3A of the SPEED Act, which makes it very hard for courts to ever intervene in a project. Can you break that section down for us? Tell us how that's going to work in the real world if it was law.
I think it's going to work to block most, if not all, efforts to challenge NEPA noncompliance. And the reason is that the statute requires any litigant in a NEPA challenge to demonstrate that an agency's failure to adequately consider the input provided that person during the comment period has caused it direct harm. Well, that can't be proven. NEPA is an entirely procedural statute. The Supreme Court has made it clear that agencies need to explore the environmental implications of proposed actions, but once they have done so and reported that out to the public, they don't have to listen to what the environmental document they prepared says. They're free to ignore it.
Right.
So, sure, you can require the agency to consider input, but it doesn't have to do anything with that input. So there's no way to prove that had the agency considered your input, it would have come out differently in a way that avoided harm.
Right. And so Mr. Hochman said in his testimony that under this law, agencies would still have to take the hard look that NEPA requires, but there's nothing to make sure that they actually do that. And so what I want to ask you about is, let's say you do have a claim that gets through, and let's say an agency has totally blown it, failed to take a hard look. What does the SPEED Act do to block courts from intervening even in that scenario?
The most problematic provision, as I said during my oral testimony, is the one that precludes courts from enjoining projects pending NEPA compliance. So suppose that a court finds that an agency has violated NEPA, perhaps even egregiously. It can remand the action back to the agency to reconsider its NEPA analysis, but it can't stop the project from proceeding in the interim. That runs directly contrary to longstanding law dating back at least to 1946 when Congress passed the Administrative Procedure Act. The APA says courts have the authority to set aside unlawful agency action. Set aside has been interpreted by Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, among others, to mean issue injunctions. And it doesn't matter that NEPA is an entirely procedural statute because the APA says courts should set aside actions taken by agencies without observance of procedure required by law.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Last question. I find this amazing that the party that thinks government is always wrong is stripping away the most important guardrail to make sure government is not wrong. But if this became law, what incentive do federal agencies have to take a serious, hard look and actually get it right?
Very little, if any, because they would know that it doesn't matter whether we make mistakes, our projects are going to proceed anyway. Maybe we'll have to go back to the drawing board and redo our analysis. But in the end, the project proceeds at pace no matter what we've done or not done in terms of NEPA compliance.
Thank you, Mr. Lichtman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Chair Westerman, and I want to thank my good friend, Democrat Jared Golden, for bringing this bipartisan piece of legislation forward, and I look forward to it passing the House. Mr. Harrell, in your testimony, you speak about the nexus between permitting reform and international and economic competitiveness. Can you expand upon how failing to act on permitting reform will have on America's competitiveness on the global stage?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on mining and permitting related issues. It's directly correlated. I mean, I think we've heard very directly from the chief hyperscalers in the United States that power is the long pole in the tent in scaling up our data center capacity. As we think about onshoring more American manufacturing, a significant priority of Republicans and Democrats here in this Congress, we need more reliable, affordable electricity to power that growth. And so the only way that we're going to keep pace and continue growth in this country is with more clean, affordable, reliable power.
Also in your testimony, you note that NEPA is not the only law passed by Congress meant to protect and safeguard our environment. In fact, you note that Congress passed laws like the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act after NEPA was signed into law. Can you clarify something? Will amending NEPA jeopardize environmental protections and regulations like some of my colleagues on the opposite side of the dais have led us to believe?
No, NEPA is a procedural law, and it's effectively the first gate in the permitting process. You will still have to comply with all these bedrock environmental laws, like the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, that all require permits. NEPA is largely like giving you the rules of the road to get through the process.
Thank you. So if we pass the NEPA reforms and the SPEED Act, our environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water and Clean Air Act, will remain on the books. Is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Hochman, in your testimony, you speak about the importance of permitting reforms like those in the SPEED Act for the build-out of transmission lines and renewable energy. I'm a bit confused because some of my colleagues have been claiming this is a handout to, quote, big oil and, quote, it puts polluters over people. Can you help clarify this? Would the reforms in the SPEED Act benefit all kinds of projects, including renewable energy projects and the build-out of transmission lines?
Representative, thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. This is a tech-neutral permitting reform. And I think you can see in the response to the SPEED Act that all sorts of industry are pleased to see these permitting reforms on the table. Everybody from the American Council on Renewable Energy to traditional energy interests to the hyperscalers. So absolutely, everybody stands to benefit.
Thank you. And turning to the SPEED Act's judicial review provisions, the bill would set a 150-day statute of limitations for litigation over NEPA reviews. Mr. Hochman, would these provisions block interested parties from commenting on an EA or EIS during the NEPA review process?
Representative, no, the 150-day statute of limitations is eminently achievable for those who want to bring a suit. In fact, a study came out 1 month ago from Resources for the Future, which showed the litigation cycle for anybody who's litigating against a geothermal project, a wind and solar project, and almost every single one was within that 150-day window. So absolutely achievable.
Thank you. Would these provisions impact an interested party's ability to sue over other environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, or the Clean Water Act?
It would not.
So the provisions simply impact a party's ability to sue over paperwork or process or procedure. They don't impact the party's ability to sue over substantive issues or deficiencies in the permitting process. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. I just want to thank the witnesses here today. I know that some of my good friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle may not disagree or may not agree with the SPEED Act. But I will tell you that a lot of times I hear my colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle talk about process and process and process. There's some of them that will process the hell out of something and never let it go. And Mr. Glicksman just, talked about lawsuits and whatever. We know that the weaponization of the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, et cetera, are put forth to stop some of these projects. I've seen it happen in Minnesota. We've seen it happen in Alaska and other natural resource states. So I think this is an opportunity. This is a very, very good start as we move into this next century. So, Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, the lead co-sponsor of the SPEED Act, Mr. Golden. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you for working with me on the SPEED Act. This has been a good bipartisan effort from the start. Both the chairman and I are going to remain committed to trying to keep it that way as we move through the process here. And, right now, as we speak, we have an equal number of Dem and Republican co-sponsors sitting at about 3 and 3. I really have 2 questions here, but I want to throw the first one over to you, Mr. Chair. Specifically, we've heard some feedback that this bill, the SPEED Act, would undermine and impede community engagement during the permitting process. So we've had a lot of meetings, at the member level and with different stakeholders out there over the last several months. I want to give you the opportunity to walk us all through whether or not that is indeed the case in our conversations and feedback from stakeholders out there.
Thank you, Representative Golden. I'm glad to engage in a colloquy with you on that. And that's been something that we wanted to protect through the process. And we actually don't change anything as far as people commenting during the process. But what we're trying to do is speed the process up. And on the back end of the process, where there's a 6-year window now to file suit on something that was supposedly settled in the record of decision, we've been able to agree that that time frame should be reduced to 150 days. So it absolutely allows all groups who want to comment on a project to make their comments during the permitting process and to have those comments heard.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, through the years, there's been many projects. So we're, without taking one side or the other, I've always been an advocate of making sure that the public has input in front of the federal agencies that are part of the process. So I think that's important, and just wanted to clarify that. I want to point out that one top-line message against the SPEED Act is that it's a permitting process written by and for fossil fuel polluters and extractive industries. I feel like this ignores the reality that wind, solar, and other clean energy projects face significant delays because of NEPA litigation. The problems with the NEPA process are energy neutral, meaning they can be detrimental to both fossil fuel and renewable energy projects. In Maine, we've seen environmental NGOs that have split on some clean energy projects, and those opposed use NEPA to delay while a public opinion campaign was waged against the project, funded by fossil fuel companies who just didn't want the competition. These problems with NEPA can cut both ways, and so too should be the solutions. This is a pro-energy bill that takes, an all of the above energy technology neutral approach. Mr. Harrell and Loris, Mr. Hochman already got a chance, but do you want to weigh in a little bit more on ways that you've seen the permitting process hinder clean energy expansion and development?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for your leadership and your willingness to engage and drive forward on what we think is the single largest barrier to deploying new clean energy in this country, our broken permitting system. Just to underscore, of solar and wind projects that underwent EISs, 30% of the solar projects were litigated, 50% of the wind projects were litigated. On average, it's extended at least 15 months of the permitting process. Nearly 66% of solar projects face litigation in some shape or form, the highest rate among technology types. So there's a major challenge here, and this is data from Stanford. So you're seeing very direct, tangible barriers to building new clean energy across technology areas because of our current system. And I think this bill finds a way to put limitations, but still allow folks to weigh in the process, to litigate when there are egregious errors. I mean, we've got to set a predictable process, set some rules of the road, expectations that get us to a green light or a red light. That's essential for our energy future. It's essential for U.S. and global climate action. It's essential to our competition with China.
If I could just add, in addition to all of those statistics for the mature clean energy technologies, it's also that barrier for the innovative clean energy technologies of tomorrow, the ones that are working with the Department of Energy through the Loan Program Office. It could be the FERVOs and the enhanced geothermal. So we're not just talking about the mature clean energy technologies, renewables, wind and solar, but we're also thinking about, we have all of these opportunities for clean baseload power. A lot of them don't really know how to navigate the NEPA process because they're young, they're smaller companies, they don't have the cash flows to hire a bunch of lawyers and consultants. And so this is not just about fixing for those incumbent projects, but also for the innovative technologies of the future.
Thank you, appreciate it, and yield back my 5 seconds.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Glicksman, have you ever represented a company that has gone through the NEPA process to create a major industrial project?
I have not.
You've never represented a company through this process?
I have not.
Thank you. Mr. Hochman, will environmental reviews continue under this bill?
Yeah, absolutely.
Will applicants still have to provide a full analysis of their projects?
Yes, and you know, under the many other environmental statutes as well, which remain in place.
What's the longest review you've ever seen of a project that has gone through, for example, an EIS? What are some of the times you?
Well, I suppose the longest reviews I've ever seen are the ones that never ended. There are a number of projects that were canceled or sort of permanently in limbo as a result of the NEPA process, and that could be everything from a transmission project to a traditional energy project to a low carbon project. So yeah, there are many projects that go through the NEPA process and get
So
canceled.
you're saying you've seen projects that it's been never ending?
That's correct.
Not uncommon for 10 years?
Not uncommon. It's definitely happened many times.
How many projects do you think are out there that are an idea that someone has, where this serves as a deterrent from someone even bothering to go through the process?
Yeah, we actually have a term for this. We call it the dark matter of NEPA, where it's basically all of the projects that never even get off the ground.
You call it what?
The dark matter of NEPA.
The dark matter.
And I'll give you one classic example of this. It's that, the vast majority of potential for geothermal and solar, for geothermal are on federal land, and a great deal of potential for solar is also on federal land. And yet the vast majority of projects that are actually built are not on federal land because they're built to avoid the federal nexus and thus the NEPA process, right? And as we deploy more and more of this energy, it's going to be harder and harder to site away from the federal land where so much of the potential is. So it's a huge issue.
Mr. Harrell, does China have a NEPA analysis like we have in the United States?
They do not.
Do they use a NEPA analysis with their Belt and Road projects that they've been doing around the world?
They do not. But the U.S. has immense environmental standards to make sure that we build properly in a more environmentally efficient way and drive forward. And
even in comparison to the European countries which adopted the so-called green fantasy, isn't it true that it is America that was the one that reduced our CO2 footprint? Isn't that accurate?
this is true. The U.S. has significantly reduced its CO2 emissions, and U.S. LNG exports have significantly contributed to global emissions reductions.
And in the meantime, some of those that were hectoring us about that, they really haven't reduced their footprint, have they?
I think we need to see U.S. leadership to drive new technology forward, invest here, build faster here, and then the U.S. should be exporting that technology abroad. That's the recipe to reduce global emissions and meet our global energy needs.
So you guys would not accept the challenge. I'm going to accept the challenge from the gentle lady from Arizona in regards to so-called renewables. The one that kills endangered species on a regular basis, the one that blights bucolic valleys, hills and valleys in Wisconsin. I grew up in a place that's legendary. It's called the driftless. People speak of it in almost ecumenical terms. I grew up there on a dairy farm, and you're seeing thousands of acres that are being transformed now with wind and solar panels on them as this enormous amount of money is pumped out from the federal taxpayer to be able to build these. $1,000 an acre they're paying farmers who typically would have to pay $200 an acre for their rent. And it's distorting not just rural America and serving as a blight, but it's also driving up electricity prices. As my state has adopted more with their Public Service Commission, allowing more and more of these wind and solar industrial sites, they are not farms, they are industrial sites. As more and more of them are built, electricity prices are up $2 billion since 2019 in aggregate in the state of Wisconsin. Tens of thousands of acres being covered by these wind and solar. I would just conclude with one question. Mr. Loris, name all the minerals that are going to have to be mined if we are going to continue with wind and solar as a preeminent source of electricity.
I don't know if I have enough time to do that, but it is clear that clean energy technologies, electric vehicles, batteries are more mineral intense than their conventional counterparts, and so we are going to need tremendous demand, not just for energy, but for defense technologies, for our laptops, for our cell phones, and we need to do that here in the United States, where there's economic opportunities, but also we can do it much more clean than our international counterparts.
When the gentlelady from Arizona introduces a bill to allow mining in America, then I will take her admonitions seriously. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Huffman, you have a UC request.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I do have a UC request. This speaks to the sort of hijacking of the abundance narrative in service of fossil fuel. I'm asking to enter into the record a 2024 paper, Permitting Reform's False Choice. This is the first national review of federal permits and environmental reviews for energy infrastructure completed over the last decade. Found that 95% of clean energy projects went through streamlined permitting procedures. Less than 5% even needed a comprehensive environmental review, and significantly only 29 out of nearly 2,000 wind and solar projects were challenged in court. That is 1.5% of all projects. Very important context for this conversation.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It may surprise some people to hear me say this, but I want to get to yes on this bill. I'm not there now, but I want to get there because I understand that for those of us who are good Democrats who idealize Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and know that we need to build out our infrastructure, repair our highways and bridges, and achieve the clean energy transition and so much more, we need to make it easier to build in this country again. And we have to find that right balance between making it easier to build in this country and protecting our environment, our heritage, tribal sovereignty, and all the rest. I want to get there, but I'm not there today for a couple reasons that have been mentioned already, but bear repeating. Number one, this conversation we're having about how to find the right balance between NEPA reviews and making it easier to build, this is a normal conversation to be having. But we are having this normal conversation in an abnormal time, a time when the Trump administration is unilaterally and most likely illegally canceling and stopping clean energy projects, including a very important project in my district, the Revolution Wind project that was set to deliver energy to the grid at a below market rate for consumers and meet a third of my state's electricity demand. It's a big deal. There are workers right now stuck on boats off the coast of my district who don't know when they'll be able to go back to work or not. The administration has also unilaterally canceled funding for staffing for NEPA reviews. And so I'm just going to put that out there because in concept, this is a conversation that I'm open to having on this bill that I think we should be having, but we cannot ignore the broader context here that if my colleagues across the aisle, at least some of them, and I believe the chairman believes this, are advocating for an all-of-the-above energy strategy, you can't say that you're for that and pass it through Congress when you know that the Trump administration is going to block the clean energy part of all of the above. And so that is something that we're going to have to deal with. On the bill itself, I do have a couple of questions, and I don't know if the chair or any of our witnesses would like to weigh in. There's a section that interests me that, let me make sure I get this right. It says that an agency is not required to prepare an environmental document with respect to a proposed action if that project has already been reviewed essentially by states or tribes, and that state or tribal review meets the requirements of the act. So essentially saying that if the review has already been done at the state level or the tribal level, that counts toward the federal review. And in concept, that makes sense to me, right? Why do the same thing twice? But it occurs to me that different states and tribes most likely have very different standards for the types of reviews that they conduct. And so would this bill, or is there an openness to amending the bill to ensure that there's at least some sort of baseline level of what the standard should be for a state-level environmental review in order to meet the federal standard, to have that, take the federal standards place?
Mr. Magaziner, I'll be glad to respond to that. On the part about, is there space to modify the bill? Absolutely. That's why we have a hearing, so we can get input, so we can go back and review and see if there's something we can change to make the bill better. As far as those specifics, I'll let the witnesses tackle that.
Congressman, I'm happy to hop in a very tangible example where this could make sense, as long as you ensure the rigor and the standards here, and it's with the EPA's review of Class 6 permits, for example. So in many cases, the EPA delegates permitting authority to states if they can show that they can uphold the minimum standards of a permitting decision, and we've seen that dramatically accelerate permits for Class 6 permits. So I think that kind of concept and relying on structured
I don't mean to cut you up, but I want to try to get one more question. And I would just suggest again, I think the importance of having those minimum standards enumerated is going to be important for me, for my support. But in concept, I hear what you're getting at. And then with the time I have left, public comment in the bill would be limited to individuals or groups that can demonstrate direct harm. And then standing would only be for those who are allowed to comment. But it occurs to me that, an endangered species being impacted, or maybe a historical site being impacted, is there a person that could demonstrate direct harm, or do we need to make some exceptions to allow certain types of public comment on topics where there isn't a person that necessarily can demonstrate direct harm, but there is clearly harm that would be caused by the project? Is there an openness to modifying that? To anyone, to the chair or to anyone else?
I'll take that, and your time has expired, but I'm saying there's an openness to make this bill work.
Yeah.
And if we can keep the environmental protections in place and speed the process along, that's where my interest lies.
I thank you. And I'll just say, if there's openness to improving the bill, I'd like to be part of that conversation. But it's also going to take some changes, I think, in the administration's behavior, because we are operating in an unusual and very destructive context here coming out of the White House. But I welcome the continued conversation.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let's see, Mr. Hochman, are you, it's kind of like the NEPA Act, the Clean Water Act, specifically Section 404, contains vague defined procedural requirements that have produced significant delays in projects in my area and for the citizens of in Florida. I'm wondering what lessons we can learn from the SPEED Act that would help the Clean Water Act when we seek to fix that permitting process.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Representative. I mean, one of the challenges that we sometimes see with Section 404 of the Clean Water Act for those individual permits is those individual permits often count as a major federal action, and thus they set off NEPA review themselves. In fact, that's one of the things that's happening right now with the semiconductor facility in New York, which got money from the CHIPS Act. The Building Chips in America Act exempted it from NEPA for the loan, but it didn't exempt it from NEPA for this Section 404 process. And so that semiconductor facility still hasn't broken ground. And so certainly when we think about the way in which the 404 process could be improved by a law like the SPEED Act, because the 404 process kicks off that burdensome NEPA review, efforts to streamline NEPA end up streamlining the 404 process itself.
Thank you very much. I've long been a supporter of efforts to improve America's critical infrastructure and ensure its modernization for the 21st century, whether it's transportation, aviation, energy, or other aspects of it, infrastructure. My Florida constituents suffer from the expensive, unnecessary bureaucratic delays. So, Mr. Harrell, can you explain how the legislation being heard today will ensure that America is able to develop and to build more efficiently to unleash America's energy?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. It would resolve some outstanding questions out there to provide more predictability in this process. In the end, time is money. Developers need a predictable process, the rules of the road that they're going to go forward to drive through in a project. And this makes it very clear and it sets good policy to restore what the intention of NEPA was, which is a procedural law. Lay out the rules of the road, you go through that first stage gate, and then you move forward in getting permits that are required by other statutes like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. And so it's just critical that we have a predictable process, and then it very importantly puts some limitations on the judicial process to ensure that we get to a final yes or no at some stage. And it sets reasonable requirements, limitations on where stakeholders can engage, but they absolutely can still engage, that drive towards a green light or a red light. In the end, we have to let this country build, and this bill puts forward a really clear pathway to how you get to either a yes or a no.
Thank you very much. That's a good submission. Yes or no? That's a great goal. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Elfreth, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your engagement on this. And like my colleagues, I too want to get to yes. I would like to be in a place where I can deliver big, bold projects for my community in this nation again, that we can do that. But I think the devil is in the details here, and I would like to work together to figure this out, particularly as it relates to critical renewable energy projects we've been talking about, national security priorities, transportation projects, the like. I too wish we were having this conversation in a bubble, that this committee and the good faith negotiations could occur where we could legislate these reasonable reforms to that permitting process and appropriately balance those environmental and heritage protections and other policy priorities of the moment. But just for the record, as my colleagues have pointed out, we're not in a bubble, and that this administration has been openly hostile to renewable energy projects, including the Revolution Wind project in my colleague, Congressman Magaziner's home state of Rhode Island, that was 80% of the way constructed, and it was paused. So we have to keep the important context of this moment here in mind during these negotiations. And I'm going to sit here, and I say this quite a bit, Mr. Chair, but I'm not going to pretend like a law that was passed decades before I was born is perfect. At the same time, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we have to work together on this. So I want to kind of focus in, Mr. Glucksman, on you highlighted the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, the bipartisan consensus-based way that this committee, before I got here, was able to work towards that solution, that we need to be thoughtful, we need to review it. Can we talk about some of the process there a little bit more? I want to hone in on one aspect of the SPEED Act as it's proposed, Mr. Chair, the judicial review. I think we can all agree 6 years is just too long, but 150 days is not enough, particularly as it relates to meaningful community input, particularly amongst our tribal communities, engaging in an attorney, having that attorney turn around a response. All of those are really, really important. So, Mr. Glucksman, can you just speak to the pressures and why 150 days is not the answer here, and what perhaps could be the right number?
Let me first respond to the beginning of your question, which is what did the Federal Fiscal Responsibility Act do? It set timelines for preparation of NEPA documents, environmental assessments, environmental impact statements. It set page limits, and it authorized the broader use of categorical exclusions, which are likely to be the quickest routes through NEPA evaluations. All those things ought to result in a streamlining of NEPA analysis. In terms of public input, the provision that actually bothers me the most is the one that says that once an agency has published a notice of intent to prepare an environmental document, like an environmental impact statement, it need not consider any further scientific or technical data. Well, the time for public input is after the issuance of a notice of intent. And therefore, the statute basically says all public input can be ignored because it's coming too late in the process. Coupled with that, the short deadline for filing NEPA evaluation, I think the result is that this is not a bill, despite the intention of the drafters, I think, to the contrary, that will in fact invite public input and take it into account in a serious way.
I'd also like to hone in on another point made by my colleagues, but I think it's imperative here. We're not in a bubble. This administration is also firing civil servants and federal employees who are tasked with this very evaluation, left and right. Can you speak to, are we in a position as a federal government to be able even to deliver on the reforms of the SPEED Act, given the limitations of our federal workforce at this moment?
I think the cuts in federal workforce are likely to make it more difficult to comply with the FRA deadlines. And to move things along expeditiously. There's going to be a shortage of agency personnel, and there's going to be, in particular, a considerable loss of expertise from people in the agency who've been doing this kind of work for years. And those things, I think, are going to contribute mightily to further delays.
In my 30 seconds remaining, Mr. Hochman, Mr. Lourdes, and Mr. Harrell, have you ever helped company through the NEPA review process?
I have not.
Me neither.
I have not.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I think we have a little trend here. And so I would suggest that perhaps we get together with folks, not that I disrespect your input, but with folks who have actually gone through it together on a bipartisan basis and try to get through the details of this bill. Thank you.
I think we've got some of those on the dais today. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. In the years that we've been talking about permitting reform, whether it was when I was on Energy and Commerce Committee or other places, we get all excited, hopeful, and with great fanfare and in many cases bipartisanship approach, it ultimately withers on the vine. And I'm hoping this is not the case. I'm grateful to Mr. Westerman for bringing the SPEED Act before the full committee so we can analyze the benefits of meaningful bipartisan NEPA reform, as well as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who want to get to yes. And I think that's a positive we ought to hitchhike on. If we are to power the next several decades of potential, we must start with the basics, and it certainly starts with NEPA. The SPEED Act presents an opportunity to make lasting change, and I hope we can move this bill forward in the House soon. During our July hearing, I highlighted the bureaucratic maze of permitting and its threats to our energy security, representing the energy district of Michigan, with over 40% of all energy produced in my district between Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, nuclear, coal, wind and solar, natural gas, all there. The current system is expensive, it's inefficient, and threatens not only our ability to develop critical infrastructure, but jeopardizes our national security. The SPEED Act would codify narrowing the scope of NEPA, reduce duplicative review, clarify the definition of major federal action, building on fiscal responsibility. Mr. Harrell, can you speak to the impact of clarifying the definition of major federal action and codifying principles of the 7-county Supreme Court decision?
Yes, this is one of the most critical policy steps being made here in this legislation. So obviously the Supreme Court ruling 8-0 unanimous decision aims at narrowing down the scope and of the separate from time and place of where you're evaluating projects. And what's critical here is Congress steps in and codifies these principles into law so that it's longstanding. Even Justice Sotomayor's decision, her concurrence expresses some frustration that after a 2008 ruling where they made a decision related to this, we haven't really seen it play out. It really underscores the need for bipartisan congressional action here to codify some of these limitations and really get NEPA back to its procedural roots.
Okay, thank you. In the time between 1969, when I happily graduated from high school, I was born, and headed off to State University to major in forestry. NEPA passed this body, and in 2025 we have seen technology rapidly evolve, new industries come about, and powerful computers can now be held in the palm of our hands that are way beyond the computers that were involved in our lunar landing on the moon. Mr. Harrell, can it be said that our procedural permitting process is stuck in the 60s and holds back some potential for American people?
Yes, absolutely. We have to modernize our system, and I think that provides more transparency for government, for our constituents, and for investors who are trying to make big investments to provide and grow our economy.
It is time, and we've got to do it. We just have to do it. Mr. Huckman, how does our archaic permitting process give China an upper hand in the global AI and energy space? And how would legislation before us allow us to counter China's chokehold on the critical mineral supply that we know is real?
Yeah, so we know that one of the most important things for winning the AI arms race is just having energy available. And already in the United States, companies like NVIDIA are saying just the availability of energy is the #1 consideration they have when figuring out where to put a data center. And so we're running towards an electricity shortfall. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is because of our permitting process. We take far too long to deploy electricity. And on the critical mineral side, it takes us 29 years on average to develop a new mine. That puts us second worst in the world, better only than Zambia. And one of the main reasons for that is our permitting process as well. And so it's critical that we modernize this process for the needs of the 21st century.
Thank you. Many more questions to develop this, but my time is expiring, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ranker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a unanimous consent request addressing this trope that Democrats will not change NEPA, that it is a sacred, kind of scripture that we refuse to modify. There actually is a law that would meet those descriptions, and that is the 1872 mining law. The Democrats have been trying to modernize and change for years, and Republicans refuse to touch one part of it. So I'd like to enter the 1872 mining law, making mining great again from President Grant's era. Sacred scripture.
Making mining great again. Amen. Without objection.
Yeah.
Representative Brownlee from California, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just start by saying I'm glad to hear that Chairman Westerman is certainly open to making this bill better, because I do believe that we do need reform. Like Mr. Magaziner stated earlier in this hearing, one of the greatest concerns I have about these discussions around permitting reform this Congress is the unprecedented and hostile attacks on clean energy by the administration, seemingly with the full backing of my Republican colleagues. Over the last 8 months, we've seen a near constant attack on clean energy investments. My district has suffered in meeting its clean energy goals with the administration clawing back or freezing vital resources that were promised for specific projects, costing jobs and economic growth in my district. It doesn't feel like we're right now in the moment working in good faith. In this environment, we have real consequences: lost jobs, higher energy costs, poorer health, missed opportunities for families across America. So, Mr. Harrell, I'll ask you, and let me just say, ClearPath and ClearPath Action, you guys do good work, so thank you for that. And thank you for your support on clean energy in all of its forms. I'm just going to ask you point blank, with the administration defunding all of these clean energy programs, does that concern you in terms of our progress towards a clean energy economy?
I would say, general, we think the major fluctuations between political administrations is a major problem. We need a predictable system that not only improves the system today, but for the next 20 years. That's what's going to drive American leadership, and so we've got to eliminate these major shifts in regulatory policy that go election to election, administration to administration.
Well, 4 years is a big step backwards in terms of moving forward on the clean energy front anyway, but I hear what you're saying. Mr. Glicksman, putting aside affordability and environmental benefits, do you believe the type of permitting reform being proposed here would actually help clean energy projects move forward on the same footing as fossil fuels? Understanding in today's environment, the administration is certainly pushing fossil fuels over any other energy sources at the moment.
In a vacuum, that might be so, but as you and your colleagues have pointed out, we're not operating in a vacuum. The president at the most recent cabinet meeting said no wind projects will proceed under his administration, and so it seems pretty clear to me that there's a thumb on the scale in favor of fossil fuel-based energy and against clean energy like solar and wind.
Thank you for that. In my district, I mentioned it earlier, but climate change is not just talking about climate change is huge in my district. It's wildfires burning more frequently, sea level rise, threatening thousands of homes and businesses in coastal Ventura County, and growers struggling with shifting seasons and dwindling water supplies. So, Mr. Glicksman, again, how would allowing agencies to disregard climate change and NEPA reviews depart from long-standing practices, and what would that mean for communities on the front line of climate change?
I think it would increase the risk of exposure to environmental harms that result from climate change, including things like wildfires and sea level rise that cause flooding, exposure to more extreme storms. All these have been linked by scientists to climate change. I think one of the good aspects of NEPA, as well as some of the other legislation passed early in the 1970s, is that it's worded generally. And one of the reasons it's worded generally is that it doesn't lock policymakers or agency officials into knowledge that existed at the time the statute was adopted. And so climate change was understood back in 1969, but not nearly as well as it is now. NEPA allows analysis to conform to current knowledge. So the more we know about climate change, the more reasonable and it is to expect agencies to factor climate analysis into their NEPA evaluations, even if they wouldn't have done so 40 or 50 years ago.
Thank you for that, and my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you. Before we go to Representative Crank, I've got some things to enter into the record. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Fervo Energy which states, the process of executing the environmental analysis and seeking multiple approvals required by the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 to develop geothermal on public lands can take up to 10 years or more. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the report from Breakthrough Energy titled Understanding NEPA Litigation. This report shows that between 2013 and 2022, 33% of NEPA appeals cases targeted renewable energy production. As a statement indicates, NEPA presents significant barriers for renewable and conventional energy sources alike. And finally, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the Niskanen Center report detailing that NEPA also has a significant impact on transmission, showing more than a quarter of all new transmission lines from 2010 to 2020 went through an environmental impact statement, and these projects see 31% litigation rates and 12% cancellation rates. Without objection, so ordered. Representative Crank from Colorado, are you up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to submit a letter for the record from the American Exploration and Production Council supporting the SPEED Act that, quote, puts NEPA back on track, unquote, to address the needs of the modern energy economy.
Without objection.
Thank you. I heard Mr. Glicksman say, I think I'm quoting it pretty closely, it's not the time to reform NEPA. NEPA was passed 55 years ago. So I guess I'd ask, when is a good time? China is not held back by NEPA. In fact, I would guess that, in fact, I'd almost guarantee that somewhere in the world, either now or in the next couple of hours, there'll be a couple of Chinese agents going through and noting everything that was said in this hearing, because they think everything is warfare against the United States, and they know that we use NEPA. There are people here in America who use NEPA to hold back projects, and that's the reason some don't like the SPEED Act. That's the dirty little secret here, is that they use NEPA to stop the projects. There, I said it out loud. But look, Colorado is home to minerals and energy resources necessary to power America's future economy. And as the fourth largest oil-producing state, responsible for nearly 4% of the total U.S. crude output, and with vast deposits of critical minerals and rare earths, Colorado is uniquely positioned. We're also home to one of the nation's premier mining institutions, the Colorado School of Mines. Our future resource development hinges on the ability to permit and develop projects efficiently. In a prior hearing at this committee, we discussed China's stranglehold on the critical minerals supply chain and the risks it poses to our energy and national security. The United States simply cannot afford to remain dependent on foreign adversaries for the materials that power our grid, that build our defense weapon systems, and that drive innovation in next-generation energy technologies. I would ask a question to Mr. Harrell, and first I'd like to thank you, Mr. Harrell, for the great work that your organization does. But as we review the three permitting reform bills before us today, how would these measures help strengthen America's geopolitical position in developing our own energy and mineral resources? And what are the consequences if Congress fails to act?
The consequences of Congress failing to act is that we lose this global competition. We are way past the time of needing to enact bipartisan, politically durable, act in a bipartisan and a politically durable way that sets the permitting process that we know we need to compete today and for the next 20 years.
So the central focus of this committee is clear. How do we modernize permitting? How do we make it more efficient, and how do we reduce unnecessary delays? We often talk about the lack of agency coordination and duplicative reviews in the NEPA process. The Fiscal Responsibility Act took the first steps in 40 years in modernizing permitting, and it put timelines in for completion of EAs and EISs and instructing how agencies are to coordinate with each other. The ePermit Act would approach modernizing permitting from a technological standpoint. And Mr. Harrell, I'd ask you, how can an online platform ensure agencies can meet the deadlines set in the FRA?
Yep. It is critically important to have some consistency. I mean, we have talked very directly with Trump and Biden administration permitting officials who expressed extreme frustration with the lack of consistency on the nomenclature and data that we're using, that there isn't a centralized system, that there's not uniform federal standards, and that we're not publishing this data so that we can hold all stakeholders accountable. And so I think this is a no regrets move to more modernize our permitting system, and I think we'll see significant benefits from it across the permitting structure.
Thank you, Mr. Harrell. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman. Mr. Stauber, you.
I ask unanimous consent that the following letter from the General President of the Laborers International Union of North America.
Mr. Stauber, could you use your microphone, please?
I'm sorry. I ask unanimous consent that the following letter from General President of the Laborers International Union of North America in support of H.R. 4776 be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
IWC request.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this June 2025 study, quantifying the substantive influence of public comment on U.S. federal environmental decisions under NEPA. This speaks to the way in which NEPA actually results in substantive changes and improvements in projects. 64% of projects showing modifications to alternatives, 42% showing modifications to mitigation plans, 11% leading to the selection of an entirely new preferred alternative. So not stopping projects, but improving them is the way it works.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida. Mr. Soto, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. You know, we've seen the use of NEPA in a very collaborative way. In Central Florida, we had the I-4 expansion, which is still going on. For those of my constituents, they know what it's like to sit in traffic. And we've seen the state and federal government and contractors come together for that. In addition, through this committee, we've worked in a bipartisan fashion to protect the Kissimmee River. Now there's a study that Department of Interior is doing after a $1 billion restoration, the biggest in the world. And then we see Alligator Alcatraz, which is right now a state project where the state could lose $500 million because they don't want to get reimbursed by the feds because they want to avoid NEPA. So that'll be an interesting one going forward. People are looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. I think we found an example of that in the state. I was proud to vote for the Fiscal Responsibility Act, bipartisan bill establishing timetables, fee caps. It's been the subject of a lot of discussion today. And I agree, it's a critical time for this discussion. We see Trump blocking the rural broadband program that's hurting our ranchers and our farmers, a $40-something billion program, blocking clean energy projects like wind, busting up EV battery factors, jacking up tariffs that are absolutely making these projects so much more expensive, and then deporting workers on top of it, which has hurt the state of Florida with nearly 1 million legal immigrants who are about to lose their status or already did through temporary protective status in the parole program. Followed up with a terrible jobs report, rising prices, and a worsening economy. We need to have this discussion today. Very important. And I remain open-minded to additional NEPA reforms, having voted for the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Mr. Glicksman, it's great to see. I graduated from GW Law. I had a Professor Sue as my environmental law professor. I still have nightmares about NACs and total maximum daily loads and all the other things that we still deal with in this committee today. You talked a little bit about how we need an initial assessment of how the Fiscal Responsibility Act goes through. It'd be great to, what is your first kind of guesstimate right now about how that's going?
I think it's premature to determine how it's going, but it seems to me.
Like your gut feelings right now. I know you're not going to have a final.
My gut feeling is that it has already accelerated the process or is likely to do so in the near future.
How much do you think, try to paint a picture for the committee, the kind of acceleration we're looking at?
Well, if it used to be that it took 4 years to prepare an EIS, and now the statute says you can only do it in 2 years, you must do it within 2 years, and there's judicial review if you don't, it's a 50% improvement right there.
I also want to talk about Chevron. Administrative law. You're bringing me back to that now, too. So with the overturning of Chevron, now agencies can actually pursue more aggressive timetables, and the courts, lacking deference. How do you think how do you think Chevron affects NEPA reviews now that agencies lack deference?
Well, there are certainly enough provisions in NEPA as amended by the Fiscal Responsibility Act that haven't been fully interpreted by agencies or courts. And if agencies interpret those provisions in ways that would expedite NEPA reviews, the courts are going to take a close look. On the other hand, if the agency interprets the statute in a way that is likely to delay projects, the courts now have independent responsibilities to rein the agencies in and say, look, the statute was designed to expedite the process. You're not doing it. You need to go back to the drawing board.
Mr. Harrell, how do you think eliminating deference of agencies under Chevron affects agencies' ability to conduct NEPA in an efficient way?
I think it underscores why bipartisan congressional action, very specific congressional action, is necessary. Now that ruling is on the books, I think
You got to
it's
get down to the
very clear.
details now, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's incumbent on this committee and leaders who want to find solutions here to come together with really specific, durable solutions that provide that direction.
Mr. Hotchman, how do you think Chevron affects this debate right now over NEPA efficiencies?
Yeah, I agree. It's absolutely critical now more than ever, I would say, for Congress to write clear laws about what the NEPA process should look like. And the other piece of this is just that there's this sort of back and forth where, yeah, Chevron absolutely changed the way that we afford deference to agencies, but then 7 counties sort of handed it back in the case of NEPA in a sort of slightly different way. So, but absolutely, the need for bipartisan action is more important than ever.
Thank you all, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina. Mr. McDowell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here to testify before this committee today. I want to point out that the hearing that we're having right now, I believe, is one of the single most important that we can have for our constituencies. Because if you look at the chart up here, it's making my blood boil just having that in the room, because it's absurd. And I think for decades, the permitting system in this country has moved further and further away from its original purpose and what was meant to be a process that balanced environmental stewardship with responsible growth has become an anchor that is dragging down American industry. And today, critical energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing projects find themselves stuck without moving for years and sometimes decades. They're stuck in a web of bureaucracy and litigation that is unnecessary. These delays, they're not just paperwork problems. They mean fewer paying jobs, higher costs for families, and missed opportunities for communities like the ones that I represent. They mean that American workers and businesses fall behind while our competitors overseas like China move full steam ahead. It is more important than ever that we strengthen our supply chains, that we modernize our power grid, and invest in our domestic energy. We cannot allow endless permitting delays to stand in the way of America continuing to dominate. True reform that we're after here means restoring balance and common sense. It means setting firm deadlines, cutting out duplication, and focusing reviews on real, actual measurable impacts, not speculative or political concerns. It means giving states and local communities who know the needs best a stronger role in making decisions instead of leaving everything to Washington and red tape. Most importantly, it means creating a system that is predictable and efficient so that investors, workers, and families know projects will actually get built. That's why proposals like the SPEED Act matter. This legislation takes real steps to modernize the process by cutting unnecessary delays, empowering states like North Carolina, and creating certainty for energy and infrastructure projects that fuel our economies. With common sense, reforms like these, lower costs for families is the outcome, and we keep America a leader in energy and innovation. My question, I guess, for you, Mr. Hochman, can you explain how the current NEPA permitting process has affected the timeline and the cost of critical energy infrastructure projects in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Thank you. When NEPA was originally created, those initial environmental impact statements were 10 pages, right? And they were incredibly quick to process. Over the years, that NEPA process has morphed and metastasized into this multi-year process that we see now. For project developers, delay is death, right? And when you have to deal with the impact of interest rates over many years, it just becomes so hard to even propose a project, let alone actually get through that NEPA process. And so you've seen examples not only of all sorts of project categories not actually being proposed in the first place, but also of projects that after going through a 7-year EIS timeline, for example, basically announce the cancellation at the end of it because market conditions have changed or they can no longer make a profit. So it's a huge problem for energy development in this country.
What role do you believe that states should play in the permitting process, and how can we empower states to help streamline this process that approvals seem to never come?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we already have all sorts of environmental laws where states actually have the authority to regulate. And in many cases, states may better understand the local conditions, and they may better understand the needs of their constituents. So absolutely, there are many cases where regulatory authority should reside with the states.
With the remainder of my time, I'll ask a simple question, but when projects take more than a decade just to clear red tape without even starting to begin, who benefits, Americans or our foreign competitors?
Certainly our foreign competitors.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. It is great to be back in this room. It's great to see my good friends here and had the honor to serve on this committee for 6 years. So thank you for opening the door, welcoming me back to talk about an issue near and dear to my heart. And when I think about this whole portfolio of issues, I always think about 3 things. First is lower energy costs for families and businesses. Second is how to improve the reliability of our energy supply. And third is ensuring we're responsible stewards of the environment for future generations. What I have seen for as long as I've been in Congress is the steady erosion by oil and gas interests, just going to say that, to erode environmental protections that keep our air clean, keep our waters safe, all about accelerating resource development, even if it means higher costs, counterintuitively, higher costs for consumers. And now what I see is something altogether worse, which is really at the behest of these same interests, weakening NEPA implementation, instituting permitting procedures for what I consider to be a most questionable energy emergency. So I ask, when will enough be enough? When our environmental protections are completely eviscerated, when our children and their children are left in an increasingly inhabitable planet with, I might add, higher energy costs to boot. So as we continue to discuss this, I think we need to be crystal clear about who would benefit if we took action under the present administration, which, again, are those same oil and gas interests. I have seen, for the last 9 months, everything possible to try to stifle clean, cheap energy. Again, it's the fastest growing and, as I said, the cheapest energy source, electricity source, going right now. I have been reading a lot about this supposed energy emergency, and I believe in good faith many of my colleagues want, I hope everybody wants to lower energy prices, but what the administration is doing, blocking the only sources of energy that can be built fast enough to meet growing demand and cheap enough to keep our constituents' energy bills in check, simply makes no sense. The administration has repealed tax credits that support the deployment of clean energy and bring down all electricity bills while maintaining billions of dollars of tax subsidies for the oil and gas industry. They've instituted onerous procedures for clean energy to get federal approvals. They've unilaterally issued a stop work order for an offshore wind project mid-construction. They've canceled a loan for a Midwest transmission line that would have delivered clean, cheap domestic energy to more states. They've withdrawn hundreds of millions of dollars of grants that were meant to create jobs and lower energy costs. They are undermining existing laws to stifle clean energy and really are driving up the price of electricity in doing so that the average American is forced to continue to pay more to these big oil and gas interests. And as we debate government funding this month, I have a simple yes or no question for all the witnesses. Do you agree that our agencies should be adequately resourced to facilitate the processing of permits in a timely manner? Yes or no?
I do.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
I thought you might all say that. Clearly, we have alignment at least on that. Yet over in the Appropriations Committee, where I will be heading in a minute, we have seen the majority zero out funding to permit wind and solar while giving fossil permitting a major boost. So I introduced an amendment to modestly increase funding for the Renewable Energy Office to account for all the new procedures the department must complete for renewables, but every single member in the majority party voted against properly funding even the all of the above energy permitting offices. All of this to say, and this is the real point, I am personally deeply skeptical that we can negotiate in good faith right now to try to accelerate permitting of any kind while there is an ongoing bad faith attack against solar and wind. I want to be able to work in a bipartisan way to build the 21st century infrastructure that we need and lower the cost of living for our constituents. I appreciate efforts like my friend Scott Peters, he's not here to hear me say this, and Dusty Johnson working on the ePermit Act to implement modern tools for a digital permitting system. But if we actually want to talk about lowering energy costs, we've got to talk about Federal Power Act reforms, setting standards for utilities to put consumers first, ending household subsidization of electricity for high-demand facilities, and we've got to address climate-fueled wildfires across the West, which are causing utility costs to skyrocket. I'm working on a bill that will do all that. I'm out of time. It's great to see you, gentlemen, and I will yield back.
Good to see you back, Mr. Levin. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Begich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it's interesting hearing the comments from some on the committee today, because I think we need to recognize that most of renewable energy, so-called renewable energy, is actually Chinese energy. And it's Chinese energy because so much of the supply chain supporting those energy sources is coming from China and is locked up by China. And the reforms that we are talking about introducing today would allow America to compete in all forms of energy by allowing us to finally mine in this country again and develop our own supply chain in this country again. And so I'm not sure how folks who support renewable energy could be opposed to smart NEPA reforms. We need these reforms in order to put our nation back on track. Wealth accrues to those who produce. Our nation's wealth is not the dollar. It is in our ability to develop our resources and add value to those resources. That's where our nation's wealth comes from. Our national regulatory framework today is a massive self-own. We are shooting ourselves in the foot, just as our adversaries are gaining ground in the race for the future. Congress has the ability to unleash the potential of our nation's resources, and it has the responsibility to do so. We must allow our nation to grow and develop. Revisions to NEPA are smart, and they are necessary for core infrastructure investments to proceed at the speed of our modern competitive reality. My first question to Dr. Glicksman. I'm from Alaska. Alaska's vast federal footprint means nearly every significant infrastructure project is subject to NEPA, even when there is strong state and local support. Do you support limited exemptions or fast tracks for strategic projects in resource-dependent states like mine?
First of all, I want to just say that I just spent a couple of weeks in the Inner Passage in your beautiful state, and I'd like to spend more time there. It's just gorgeous. I do support streamlining of critical energy projects if they're done in a way that preserves the environmental integrity of the process.
Thank you. And at a time when America is facing mounting pressure from adversaries like China in mineral supply chains and AI infrastructure, do we have a responsibility to streamline those processes for those strategic domestic production sources?
I think we do, but at the same time, it seems to me that clawing back research grants for smart and effective solar development is a way to put us behind the 8 ball rather than allow us to compete on an equal footing with the Chinese.
Appreciate that. We agree on that. Thank you. My next question to Mr. Hochman. You noted the connection between permitting delays and national competitiveness, particularly in AI and data center infrastructure. In a state like Alaska, where vast distances and seasonal constraints can add complexity, how can reforms like those in the SPEED Act ensure our state isn't left behind in the next wave of innovation and energy infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Alaska has an enormous amount of energy potential, and that energy potential is incredibly constrained by NEPA, in large part because of the federal land. And so, yeah, certainly for all sorts of industry, especially in Alaska, it's constrained by the NEPA process. Streamlining the process, these reforms that we're seeing in the SPEED Act are going to be critical for the competitiveness of the state.
Thank you. Mr. Loris, Alaska sits on vast reserves of critical minerals, as you probably well know, many of which are needed for energy storage, defense technologies, and next-generation manufacturing. Yet federal permitting delays have left us reliant on foreign supply chains. How would the SPEED Act help address the critical mineral permitting backlog, and what role can Alaska play in strengthening domestic supply chains, in your view?
Yeah, well, I think it's critically important to have a predictable, efficient process to access all of our abundance of minerals. If those commodities and minerals are increasing, it just makes all of those technologies, the clean energy technologies, the defense technologies, that much more expensive. And so to have that efficient process increases the supply from a stable source, one that is sourcing these minerals much more ethically than most of our foreign competitors and in a much more environmentally sensible manner. So this makes not just economic sense, but also environmental sense. And to have a state like Alaska take the lead on the environmental review and the permitting process, they've shown how to balance economic growth, energy production, mining, and environmental stewardship.
I couldn't agree more. I appreciate your comments. I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Gentlemen's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Randall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses here to share their testimony and perspective. As folks know, the federal government through NEPA was historically intended to represent the interests of all Americans, including tribal nations and others who are often left behind in decision-making and left to live among and with disproportionately high levels of pollution. I believe that there's definitely red tape to cut to make government work better for all of us. But like my colleague from California who spoke recently, I don't believe we see a good faith effort to speed permitting for all types of projects. Mr. Glicksman, I'm concerned that the SPEED Act changes the goal of NEPA review to have it be in line with the project sponsors' goals rather than to be an independent analysis. Would you agree with this characterization?
I do, and that, I think, relates to something I mentioned in my oral testimony, that is, the statute would be amended to say that agencies are required to define the purpose and need in a way that meets the project applicant's goals. And that's never been the law. There's been dispute about whether or the extent to which agencies are even allowed to consider private project proponent goals, but there's never been any judicial decision that says that the agency must displace the public interest with the project applicant's goals.
Yeah, thank you. That's certainly concerning to me. You know, I seen in my own community and projects across the country where we do sometimes get in our own way. We get mired in a slow decision-making process. But also, you know, I think we have to remember that NEPA was passed at a time when we saw rampant pollution and mismanagement of our public resources and real human impacts of some of those decisions, impacts that communities still live with. Mr. Glicksman, how might a 150-day statute of limitations affect particularly disadvantaged communities like any of the 12 federally recognized tribes in my district or other under-resourced communities, especially when combined with a 14-day permitting procedure where folks might not even know that a NEPA process has occurred?
Well, I think that that timeline is going to make it difficult for them to gather the information and the resource they need to effectively pursue litigation and challenging agency NEPA evaluations that they think are deficient. Litigation is expensive. You have to hire attorneys, you have to pay court costs, and tribal communities may not be able to easily afford those things. It may take time to gather the money, and 150 days may simply be too short to allow them to do so.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't want to leave any of my colleagues with the perspective that I don't want us to be more efficient. I do want government to be more efficient. I want us to be able to expand our energy resources, to be able to build housing, to be able to ensure that we are building an economy that works for real people. But I don't want us to run over the interests of real people in order to speed up projects that have real benefits for the shareholders and funders. Thank you so much for your testimony. I yield the balance of my time to the ranking member.
I appreciate the gentlelady's yielding, and I will yield back. Thanks.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the panel for being here. The conversation is of great interest to me. I'm from Oregon. The remarks regarding allowing the states to have more to say about process are of concern to me because in Oregon, that means more delay, more litigation, more judicial activism, not less. And so I'm curious about the suggestions that are, and your thoughts on the suggestions contained in HR 4776, Section 113, Judicial Review. And as an attorney, I understand delay. I understand litigation. I engaged in a lot of it, and I'm just curious as to your opinions. I'm going to start, I think, on this end, Mr. Harrell, your thoughts as to Section 113, Judicial Review, and what I'm most interested in is the focus on the word procedural as opposed to perhaps substantive challenges, because as you can tell when you read this paragraph, it's all about procedure, not about something else. Your thoughts about that focus on procedure?
Yeah, and that's the crux of NEPA. NEPA is a procedural law, and so absolutely litigation should move forward and be available if the process that is required under NEPA isn't conducted, right? And if there are we've gotten gravely off track. But far too often now, this litigation has spiraled into issues that are not in the scope of NEPA, into scope of other environmental laws, or into the scope that are not specific to an individual project or within the realm of foreseeable impacts.
Do you find it interesting that the way it reads, it says, notwithstanding Chapter 7, so forth and so on, in reviewing a claim of whether a final agency action complies with the procedural requirements of the Act. Do you view that as an attempt to limit the scope of the review to procedure as opposed to something else? Because I do, and we're doing this for purposes.
Yes, it should be limited to the procedural violations under NEPA, if there is one.
If you go further into line 5 and 6, it says, if the court determines the agency abused its substantial discretion, tell me what that means, substantial discretion, as opposed to what type of discretion?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to get at is if they go far beyond the scope of which the agency has jurisdiction over.
I would review it as, I would think it's more restrictive than that, but that's my thought. If you go a little bit further, it says the role of a court in reviewing a claim described in subsection A may not substitute its judgment for that of the agency regarding, quote, the environmental effects of a proposed agency action. How is that procedural? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to the crux of the 7-county ruling here, right? That effectively that far too often the judicial entities are stepping in and making judgment calls about responsibilities that are at the agency of jurisdiction, right? So in the case of in that particular case, critiquing whether how the agency did its environmental review and the scope of it, though they're the ones who are supposed to be making those policy judgments.
Yeah, and the idea, of course, with this statute is to somehow narrow an activist judge and restrict that person from making judgments that take the place of the agency and so forth. It says there's a further part here on restricting what happens when the court remands the matter back to the agency.
Yep.
Your thoughts on that? Because what you see some timeframes in here, you think it's actually going to stick? Think it's going to work? You think those federal judges are going to pay attention to our attempt here to limit what they can do in an order?
I think that's why congressional action is necessary. I think both from the 2008 public citizens ruling and 7 counties, you're seeing the Supreme Court express extreme frustration that you continue to see the courts step in ways that they feel like they've already acted on. And so I think the solution to ensure and provide that direct direction is to put it in statute like the policy put forth in Mr. Western, Mr. Gold's bill.
Extremely happy to see it. I'm almost out of time, so I will mention that, going back to states for a moment, in Oregon we see an attempt to use mitigation as extortion, and it's sad that we don't have more in here that would limit the use by states, the abuse, if you will, of Section 404, because this is another one of those things that unduly delays projects. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Gray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses and to my colleagues who have brought this important issue before us. Mr. Chairman, we have a water crisis in Western states. Water contractors and operators in my district throughout California invest millions of dollars on advanced drought mitigation and projects intended to increase our water storage and capacity. Despite the obvious benefits of these projects for groundwater recharge, storage, conveyance, the existing permitting process causes rampant delays and soaring costs for these projects. As you may recall, I offered an amendment to the reconciliation package to fund specific projects that would provide over 2 million acre-feet of water and move the needle on our water problems in Western states. In fact, I've got that list, Mr. Chairman, right here and have provided it to your team as well. This body failed to pass that amendment, failed to act on these projects, and we find ourselves in a unique time with both the federal and administration as well as the administration in California showing signs of life, willing to act on this topic. It would certainly be malpractice if this body didn't take advantage of that opportunity. But even if we funded every water project today, we would find ourselves years away from seeing any kind of a final product. Delays in building these projects are not due just to NEPA. We need to take a hard look at the entire federal and state and federal permitting process, how that all ties in to the ultimate decision to approve or deny these projects, and what those timelines look like. Agencies sit on applications for months and sometimes years. We need transparency throughout the decision-making process, and we need to set clear and enforceable timelines for agencies to finalize reviews. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance some of this crucial permitting reform legislation. However, the proposals before us today fall short of what we need. And I find myself concerned, Mr. Chairman, that there are colleagues on my side of the aisle who would essentially defeat the good in search of the perfect, and that there are colleagues on your side of the aisle who would rather continue to blame somebody else than solve the problem. And in summary, I think I'd like to ask you, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask for your commitment as you navigate this process to sit down and work diligently on establishing enforceable timelines to ensure, predictable permitting process, but also that collaborative process between the state and the federal government, which I think is crucial to really solving the problem.
Mr. Gray, as I've stated before, I'm open to working with anybody on the committee and anybody in the conference to make the bill more constructive and pragmatic. So look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that commitment, and we'll certainly follow up with you in your office as we navigate the process and try to make this a better proposal that could really solve the water crisis in western states.
And I'll also add that I was supportive of your water amendment, but I think it was a rules of reconciliation that didn't allow us to keep that in the bill.
Well, I appreciate that support, Mr. Chairman, and I will follow up with you on that as well. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for hosting this hearing today. And thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Hochman, in July, when the Interior Secretary rolled out the new red tape requiring his personal sign-off on virtually every permit related to solar and wind energy development, you tweeted your reaction in real time, quote, "Not good. There are lots of ways to encourage certain sources deployment. Sitting on disfavored sources permits is among the worst," end quote. To your point, it's not as though the Secretary's guidance somehow smooths out existing inefficiencies, yet it adds yet another layer of bureaucracy. And as someone who represents the state of Nevada, which the U.S. Energy Information Administration has noted that it leads the nation in solar power potential, and where we have more Department of Interior managed land than anywhere else in America south of Alaska, I share your reaction. In my state, this new Trump administration requirement hasn't been simply just a speed bump on the road to permitting. It actually has been more of a brick wall. So let me ask you this, Mr. Hochman, is there bill text in the SPEED Act that would clearly and unambiguously override this DOI directive and get effective solar and wind projects moving again?
Representative, thank you for the question. So first of all, I would say, an important response to the uncertainty and ping-ponging that we get between administrations and how they treat energy sources is for Congress to act and to add statutory authority to these permitting processes. The SPEED Act is focused on one law. It's focused on NEPA. But certainly, I would encourage Congress to think about how we stop the penduluming treatment of energy sources between administrations.
Okay, so, but is there text in that will deal with this issue in particular?
The SPEED Act adds certainty to the NEPA process, but it doesn't deal with the entire permitting process.
All right, that's what I thought. Mr. Harrell, earlier this year, I reintroduced the STEAM Act, my bipartisan bill with Congresswoman Malloy of Utah that cuts permitting tape by giving geothermal industry the same flexibility to explore and develop on previously disturbed and studied public lands that the oil and gas industry currently enjoys and has enjoyed for 2 decades. You know the STEAM Act well, and your recognition that my bill helps achieve parity in energy permitting, which is also very significant in the broader context of today's hearings. So my question is, how important would you say it is to the ultimate success of bipartisan permitting reform package that such a package restore a level playing field for permitting across technologies and lock in project parity, no matter who is in the Oval Office?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on geothermal issues. Great legislation, something I think should be sent straight to the president. I think broader permit reform should be technology agnostic. Like every technology should get a fair shake. projects should move forward, and I think we need bipartisan, durable action there. That doesn't mean that we should include some technology-specific ideas like your legislation that gets at specific geothermal issues, but by and large, as we look at some of these bigger macro-level things, we need bipartisan, congressional action that fixes this issue today and gives us the permitting system that we need for the next 20 years to compete.
Great, thanks. Is it fair to say that the business community would also welcome a technology-neutral permitting parity requirement and the increased regulatory certainty this would provide?
Absolutely. Predictability is what drives private sector investment into infrastructure projects in this country, and Congress should enact bipartisan legislation to improve that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll just end with this. After our last full committee permitting reform hearing in July, you told Political that a final permitting package should put parity-focused sideboards on the executive branch so that people who want to develop can have a seat at the table, and a process that they don't feel is weighted either for them or against them. And you emphasize the following, quote, "Let permitting be blind to technology and let investors pick winners and losers on what should be built." So I'm with you. And since our July hearing, I've worked with the Solar Energy Industries Association to draft legislative language that would do just that. You said you'd be willing to work in a bipartisan manner, and I hope I can get your commitment to find a home for some of this language in the SPEED Act in advance of its markup.
We're already working in a bipartisan manner, and we'll be thrilled to work with you, Representative Lee, to make sure we address your concerns. I think this is a broad revision to NEPA, and I think some of your concerns are already covered in the bill. We've passed some geothermal legislation in the House already, but that's an exciting area that we can continue to work on.
Great, thank you. And obviously, solar and making sure that solar energy development receives a agnostic review is important as well to my home state of Nevada. Thank you. With that, I yield.
Ladies, time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Downing, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to wave on, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. NEPA reform is essential for economic growth, and not just in my home state of Montana, but across the country. And the current system delays projects, drives up costs, and hurts our ability to build infrastructure and energy capacity that America needs. So I'm going to start, first of all, with Mr. Harrell. Codifying CEQ's permitting technology action plan through HR 4503 aims to modernize federal permitting. Can you explain how this would improve permitting timelines for energy projects and reduce unnecessary delays?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Congressman. And I think this is a critical first step that's necessary to improve the permitting process across the realm. It digitizes the federal permitting process. It develops uniform federal standards for the type of data and the nomenclature we're putting in. It creates a centralized portal, and it ensures that we're publishing that data so that we can hold everyone in the process accountable. Because I think that's been one of the critical dynamics that has really slowed down the permitting process, is that lack of transparency means it's harder to have accountability. So this is a no regrets move.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to move to Mr. Hochman. HR 573 requires CEQ to publish annual reports on NEPA's impact. How would this transparency help Congress and local communities identify bottlenecks and improve project planning?
Yeah, so historically, we haven't had reliable annual reporting of this data. And so having that data on hand is really helpful for everything from figuring out which agencies get litigated more heavily to figuring out where the bottlenecks actually happen in the NEPA process. One piece of this in particular is that it will capture that pre-NEPA process before the notice of intent is issued, which historically we haven't had very good data on. So it'll be very, very valuable.
Outstanding, thank you. Moving to Mr. Loris. In HR 4776, this limits judicial remedies to remand rather than terminating projects. Can you explain how this reform would reduce litigation risk for developers while still ensuring accountability?
Yeah, it's critically important because it allows a project to move forward, it allows agencies to make those minor corrections, because the agency decisions, a lot of those times, doesn't change. It just adds time and years to the process. And I think it helps with the litigation front on two ends. One is that the agencies don't feel like they have to litigate proof these environmental impact statements as much as they do now. We've heard from agencies say, hey, we care about environmental review, but we're doing a lot of this work for the courts right now, not for the environmental integrity of the project. And then it also reduces the incentive to sue on the front end, because a lot of the environmental activist organizations are combing through these environmental impact statements, like their copy editors, looking for any minor violation procedurally so they can sue. And so it reduces the incentive to sue on the front end as well.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for this important hearing. So I'm just going to go down the line, and I'll just go down from Mr. Harrell across. From your perspective, what's the single most important change that Congress should aim for in reforming NEPA to ensure important projects are not kept in litigation purgatory?
I think the judicial reform provisions in the SPEED Act and restoring more predictability in the process is the single largest thing we can do. I think we've seen a vicious death spiral in the federal permitting process where both the government agencies and project proponents are afraid of litigation, and so they overdo it, bring new issues into fold, and then open up more additional litigation. I think these are reasonable reforms that narrow the scope of where folks can file suit and ultimately see changes made if necessary if we broke the process, and it'll keep things much faster.
Thank you. In the interest of time, Mr. Glicksman.
I would say that the most important thing that could be done would be to facilitate coordination among all the government decision makers who are responsible for reviewing and clearing permits. That would include all relevant federal agencies, but state and local decision makers as well.
Thank you. Mr. Loris.
Yeah, I would say allowing those projects to move forward as they correct those minor procedural violations, as well as shortening that statute of limitations down from 6 years to the 150 days.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Hockman.
Yeah, right-sizing judicial review, making sure that there's a higher threshold for setting aside project reviews instead of just a harmless procedural error.
Well, thank you all for your comments. And on that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. We're down to our final question asker on this panel. That would be me. I yield myself 5 minutes. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for very instructive testimony, and I think also constructive testimony. You can see there's great interest in this subject. We're almost at 3 hours, and we're not even through the first panel yet. It's an important subject. Mr. Harrell, you talked about, I think all of you at one point talked about technology, and I was thinking about the SPEED Act and thinking about, in frontier days, it took 6 months to go from New York City to San Francisco. They were starting at one point, ending up at the same point. Today, in about 6 hours, you can go from New York City to San Francisco. You're getting from point A to point B, but because of technology, you're getting there much faster, much more efficiently, much safer. And as we look at speeding up the process, we still want to get from point A to point B, but we want to do it in a more streamlined manner. So I want to ask from a technology perspective, and I will say that I've made it a point every year to try to go to one of our national research laboratories. And I'm always inspired when I go there because I see American innovation and technology it's at the forefront. And I see how we've got AI now, which is creating a demand for permitting reform, but it's also could be used to speed permitting reform. So, Mr. Hockman, we'll start with you. In what ways can we not only use technology and innovation to speed permitting reform, but how can permitting reform help implement technology and innovation?
Yeah, so to use the AI sector as an example, the hyperscalers, for them, permitting reform is one of their absolute #1 issues right now. There's huge concern that they won't have access to the energy or access to the grid connection in order to power these data centers that they need to train these AI models. And so permitting reform is critical if we want to keep the future of artificial intelligence in the United States, to say nothing of the various other high-tech manufacturing industries that we're trying to reshore back to the United States.
Mr. Loris?
Yeah, and I would just say on the flip side, AI can be a critical tool to help inform the NEPA process. It can help look at retrospective analyses and environmental impact statements to say, okay, here's a concern that a tribe had in the past, or an environmental organization, or a community, and better inform the project developers and the agencies so they have a heads up knowing what those potential concerns look like to have and strengthen that community engagement process in the very beginning.
Mr. Glicksman, do you care to comment on that one?
I would suggest that technology can deal with antiquated data management systems that provide bottlenecks that prevent expeditious decision-making on permitting.
Mr. Harrell?
Yep. Mr. Chairman, what's exciting is we're already starting to see this, right? So Pacific Northwest National Lab is partnering with the tech community and trying to find ways where we can use AI to put initial permits in place so that the AI can detect if all of the just specific content, like the application is complete, which is something that currently today someone has to review personally and go through, and so kind of go through that type of checklist. Idaho National Lab is partnering with Microsoft at the moment and working with them on a tool for NRC licensing as well, and how the NRC can do some of the initial work to see the license application, see the different dynamics, because an advanced reactor is different than a gigawatt scale reactor. And so we're seeing our labs already do this, and I think can make an immense impact in streamlining NRC licensing and project permitting.
I see all of my colleagues have kind of left me here alone. I wish they could hear this. Maybe they're watching on their TV as they're having some lunch. But we've heard a lot of talk about the ping pong effect. And it's frustrating to me. It's frustrating to Republicans and Democrats. You see one administration come in with an agenda, and they use the full force of that administration to make decisions that upsets people on the other side of the aisle. That is, I think, a separate issue from permitting, although permitting gets wrapped up in that issue. And the last question I ask about technology, I think we're at a point where we need every electron on the grid that we can get on the grid, and we actually need more grid to put electrons on. We've had discussion in here about wind and solar. The way to make wind and solar more efficient, more cost-effective, is to have grid-level storage. Grid-level storage requires massive batteries. It requires a lot of mining. So when I asked the question about how do we use technology and innovation in the permitting process to implement technology and information in the real world, that's kind of what I was getting at. We can't do the mining to make the batteries. We can't refine the material that goes in the batteries to make wind and solar more efficient. And by the way, grid-level battery storage also makes conventional energy generating systems more efficient, because you can run them around the clock and store the energy and pull it out when you need it. So I think Congress needs to address the ping pong effect, whether it comes from a Republican administration or a Democrat administration. We were angry last Congress because lease sales were pulled, because the mine in Minnesota was taken off the table, and now you heard my colleagues across the aisle are upset. But then we get to the point of being able to permit the project when it's approved and there's funding available. So this is a process. We're talking about NEPA being a procedure. This hearing is a procedure. And I want to give each of you a chance to say what we might need to do additional in the bill to improve it. Maybe you think the bill's perfect. Maybe you think there's something we need to take out of the bill. But we really want the feedback so we can construct a better product. We'll start with you this time, Mr. Harrell.
Yeah, Congressman, I think these are important first steps to a package, but I think we need to pull together a wide variety of policies across committees of jurisdiction to really enact significant permit reform. I think getting back to the basics on NEPA is required here, but we need to delve into issues related to the Endangered Species Act, related into Federal Power Act, Clean Water Act 404, I think came up from Mr. Bentz too. for a one permit, things along those lines that are going to be really critical. We need to build more of everything, and we need bipartisan congressional action that restores predictability into the regulatory process.
It would be helpful, I think, if the provisions of the bill that sort of shackle public input into the decision-making process were amended. I think one thing would be to remove the provision that authorizes agencies basically shut their eyes at the point that a notice of intent to publish an EIS is distributed, so that agencies are required to not only solicit but consider feedback provided in response to a draft environmental impact statement in particular. Second, and related to that, I think one should remove the hurdles to standing that require a demonstration that had the agency considered the comments, the litigant would have directly been harmed. That's impossible to prove, which is going to prevent affected communities from effectively challenging and protecting their interest in court.
Well, thank you, and I just want to commend your bipartisan leadership on this over the years. I've had the privilege of testifying before this committee in the last 3 administrations and now this current administration, and so there's been steadfast efforts to streamline the NEPA process, and I think this bill hits 2 nails on the head in terms of limiting the scope and the limiting the upstream and downstream considerations, as well as the judicial review. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done on Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act. The list goes on, as well as a lot of technology-specific regulations that need to be modernized for a energy revolution in 2025 and beyond. Some of those are obviously outside this jurisdiction, but we can't just be satisfied with this legislation alone. We really need to modernize all of our environmental statutes to address the economic and environmental challenges that we face today.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what the other folks on this panel have said here. I would particularly emphasize the state water quality certification from the Clean Water Act and also making it easier to build our grid as key points to focus on beyond the SPEED Act. I think the SPEED Act is an incredibly good and strong first step. Maybe the one provision that I would consider taking a look at would be just the clarity around the state when state reviews can act as the replacement for the NEPA review, just to make sure there's clear standards around when you can and can't do that.
Thank you for that. And again, we're trying to construct a good product here. Ms. Hageman, I see you've entered the room. I was trying to use my time and your time. When nobody else is here, I just have all the time that I want.
I like that.
I will yield back and recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I apologize if I've been disruptive today. We also have a Judiciary Committee markup, and so I'm running back and forth between the buildings. There's just a couple things I want to touch upon. I obviously represent the state of Wyoming, so a lot of these issues are incredibly important to my citizens and my state and our financial well-being, as well as our ability to produce reliable and affordable energy. Just as an initial matter, I believe that some of the folks on the other side believe that the solution to the fact that wind and solar are intermittent, expensive, and not reliable is battery storage. And we all know what happened at Moss Landing earlier this year with the explosion and the horrific fires that occurred at that battery storage facility. Do any of you know how long that fire burned? It was a long time. They had a very difficult time getting it out. Do any of you have any idea of what kind of toxic constituents were released in the air as a result of that catastrophe? They were giving orders to keep people inside because of the problems associated with that. So just building more and bigger, larger, powerful battery facilities aren't the answer to energy production or energy reliability in this country. I want to focus on the categorical exclusion aspect of this particular bill. The Fiscal Responsibility Act enabled federal agencies to adopt categorical exclusions utilized by other agencies through a streamlined review process. The SPEED Act would expand this reform to include legislative categorical exclusions and set safeguards to insulate such CE adoptions from frivolous lawsuits. However, we are seeing that once adopted by agencies, the implementation of some categorical exclusions can still take over a year to be processed. Mr. Is it Hochman Mr. Hochman, how could Congress act to further streamline and provide certainty in the categorical exclusion process?
Yeah, Representative, thank you for the question. And it's funny, right? Because oftentimes we think of categorical exclusions as almost an exemption from the NEPA process. But very clearly, that's not the way that it's actually turned out in practice, where you see these forest management categorical exclusions sometimes take more than 2 years. I've heard from geothermal developers that the average for them is 6 months for the categorical exclusion process for these low impact activities. So it's clear that the process just is not working as intended. You know, I think one way to get at this is to make sure that you can deal with the current problem in the categorical exclusion process, which is this extraordinary circumstances review, which is basically this open-ended review, a review unto itself, to see whether or not the CADX may rise to a higher level of review. I think a better way to do it, for example, might be to have a checklist, sort of an open and shut checklist, where if you meet the standards that are laid out in the CADX, you're free to move forward, right? It's clearer what the outlines of that CADX are, and if you meet the standards, you can move forward.
So does the SPEED Act include some of the recommendations you've made, or do we need to follow up with you for additional recommendations?
I'm always happy to follow up and give additional recommendations. I will say one thing the SPEED Act does is it deals with some of the judicial review questions surrounding the categorical exclusion, which is definitely the other key piece of this.
But I like the idea of the checklist. In working in the state of Wyoming on a variety of projects, checklists can be awfully helpful to let an agency know whether the project actually meets the statutory requirements. The Breakthrough Institute analyzed 387 NEPA cases brought to the appellate court system between 2013 and 2022. They found that agencies won about 80% of these cases. I always tried to be in that 20% when I was suing the federal government. That's an increase of 11% from the beginning of the century. In other words, environmental reviews are rarely overturned as a result of litigation. As Justice Kavanaugh summarized in the 7 counties decision, quote, NEPA has transformed from a modest procedural requirement into a blunt and haphazard tool employed by project opponents who may not always be entirely motivated by concern for the environment to try to stop or at least slow down new infrastructure and construction projects, end quote. Mr. Harrell, what would the impact of the judicial review reforms in the SPEED Act have on excessive litigation?
It would put significant limitations of when we scrap everything altogether, ultimately, and kick it back and start over, which is extremely disruptive and should really be reserved for the most extreme examples of where procedure was not followed, which we don't see that often. And it would set a more predictable and pathway in which we can get to yes when push comes to shove. Because in the end, project developers, investors need to get to yes or no so that we can move forward on a project.
You know, it's interesting when you say those egregious cases where the agency didn't follow the process. Yesterday, we had a subcommittee hearing in this room with the Land Subcommittee. One of the things that we talked about with was the roadless rule. The roadless rule was issued in January 2001. It was one of the very last things that came out of the Clinton administration. In a 1-year period of time, the Forest Service completed a NEPA analysis affecting 58.5 million acres of land in almost every single state in the country. Think about that. A 1-year period to do a NEPA analysis on 58.5 million acres. I would say that that would be one of those egregious examples of where they did not follow the law. I see that I've run out of time. Appreciate you guys being here and your patience with me. Thank you. I yield back.
Ladies, time has expired. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony and for the time that you've spent here. I will say that this is one bite at the elephant. There are other reforms that need to take place. I see NEPA as being the most critical since it is the procedure that analyzes a lot of those underlying statutes, but we are working on Endangered Species Amendments Act. We're working on updates to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. There are other committees looking at clean air and clean water, and hopefully we can come up with a very robust permitting bill and get this passed and signed into law sooner than later. So we'll dismiss the second panel of witnesses. We have a third panel of witnesses, and we're going to take like a 15-minute break to reset the table and for everybody to get ready to go again, maybe another 3 hours on permitting reform. We're in recess.